Hello guys, welcome to Phoenix What If. So in this video, we will see, what if Naruto awakened the power of Absolute Zero and get married with Rukia Kuchiki? If you enjoy these kinds of stories, don't forget to show us some love by hitting the like button and subscribing to the channel. Your support means the world to us. Now, let's start the story. Chapter 1. The Echo of Stillness. The world was noise. It was the shriek of 1,000 birds made of pure lightning, a sound that tore at the air and promised oblivion. It was the roar of a spiraling sphere of wind chakra, a maelstrom of untamed power held in the palm of a boy's hand. It was the crescendo of a storm that had been brewing for a lifetime, born of broken bonds and desperate, suffocating love. Rain fell in thick, angry sheets, plastering blonde and black hair to their foreheads, each drop hissing as it struck the churning masses of energy they wielded. Naruto Uzumaki saw Sasuke Uchiha's face, twisted in a snarl of furious determination, illuminated by the violent blue-white light of the Chidori. The Sharingan, 3 black tomo spinning in a sea of blood, wasn't just seeing him, it was dissecting him. Searching for the single point of failure that would end him. In that gaze, Naruto saw the years of their rivalry, the laughter in the training grounds, the shared meals at Ichiraku. The blood on the grass in the land of waves, the promise whispered on a hospital rooftop. It was all there, compressed into a single, hateful instant. The Rasengan in Naruto's hand felt different. It was no longer his own. The raw, violent red of the Nine Tails chakra enveloped him, a shroud of demonic power that burned and clawed at his skin from the inside out. It granted him strength he could never have summoned on his own. But it cost him clarity. His thoughts were a frantic chorus of rage and desperation, a single mantra screamed over the din of the fox's bloodlust: bring him back. Bring him back. Don't let him go. I won't lose you. Sasuke's voice was a ragged tear in the fabric of the storm. It ends now, Naruto. Their arms, one crackling with jagged lightning, the other shrouded in a chaotic vortex, drew back. They leapt from the stony heads of Madara and Hashirama, 2 gods of a bygone era, their final battle a pale echo of this new, more intimate apocalypse. For a sliver of a second, as they hurtled toward each other over the churning water, time seemed to stretch. Naruto saw the path of the Chidori. He knew, with a chilling certainty that cut through the fox's rage, that it was faster. Sharper. More lethal. It was designed to kill. The Rasengan was a bludgeon, a crushing force of nature. It would maim. It would break. But the Chidori would pierce. It was aimed for his heart. And in that moment of absolute certainty, faced with the prospect of his own death at the hands of his best friend, something inside Naruto shifted. It wasn't the fox. It wasn't a street, radigic thought or a burst of adrenaline. It was deeper, a primordial instinct, buried beneath layers of loneliness and loud desperation, finally stirred. The world was too loud. The chaos was too much. His emotions were a wildfire. And Sasuke's were a tempest, and the collision would annihilate them both. He didn't want to win. He didn't want to lose. He just wanted it all to stop. The thought wasn't a wish. It was a command. As the tip of Sasuke's Chidori, a spear of pure, murderous energy, came within an inch of his chest, the universe held its breath. The chaotic red chakra bubbling around the Rasengan didn't flare. It receded. The vibrant, swirling blue of the Rasengan itself didn't explode. It clarified. The roaring sound of the wind vanished, collapsing into an impossible silence. From the core of the Rasengan, a point of utter blackness bloomed. It didn't radiate light or shadow, it consumed them. A wave of profound, absolute cold, a cold that had nothing to do with temperature. And everything to do with the cessation of existence, washed outward. The first thing to go was the sound. The shriek of the Chidori died, the 1,000 birds silenced in an instant. The roar of the waterfall behind them ceased. The thunderous cascade of water freezing in place not as ice, but as a perfect, crystalline sculpture of a waterfall. The rain stopped falling, each individual droplet hanging suspended in the air like a tiny, flawed diamond. Sasuke's eyes widened, the spinning tomo of his Sharingan freezing in their rotation. He felt it before he saw it. The kinetic, murderous energy of his Chidori, the very concept of its forward momentum, was being erased. A frost, pearlescent and utterly alien, crept up his arm from his fingertips. It wasn't a layer of ice on his skin. it was his skin becoming the ice. The blue-white lightning of his jutsu flickered, struggled, and then was snuffed out, leaving behind only a clawed hand of dark, unreflective crystal. The frost didn't stop. It flowed over his arm, his shoulder, across his chest, perfectly preserving the snarl on his face as it enveloped his head. There was no pain. There was no sensation at all. Just a gentle, inexorable transition from being to non-being. His last conscious thought wasn't one of hatred or victory, but of pure, unadulterated shock. Naruto's hand, holding the now silent Rasengan, made contact with Sasuke's chest. There was no explosion, no impact, just a soft thud, like a hand placed gently on a friend's shoulder. The wave of absolute stillness pulsed outward from that point of contact. The churning river below them froze solid, not with a crackle and pop, but with a silent, final shift from liquid to a smooth, black expanse of glass. The great stone visages of the first Hokage and Madara Uchiha were glazed in a thin, ethereal layer of hoarfrost that didn't glitter. It absorbed the light. The very air grew thick, heavy, and motionless. Then, the power receded, drawn back into Naruto as if it had never been there. He stood on the frozen surface of the river, his legs shaking not from exhaustion, but from the sudden, jarring return of sensation. The Nine Tails chakra was gone, replaced by a profound, unnerving calm. The rage was gone. The desperation was gone. The frantic noise in his head had been replaced by a quiet, clear silence. He could feel the blood pumping through his veins, the air, cold. So cold, entering his lungs. Every sensation was sharp, distinct, and isolated. He looked down at his hand. It was fine. No burns, no blisters. He looked up at Sasuke. His friend was a statue. A perfect, life-sized sculpture of dark, semi-translucent ice, his hand still outstretched, his face a mask of frozen shock. He was encased, but not entombed. Naruto could still see the details of his clothes, the individual strands of his hair, the frantic, wide-eyed terror in his captured gaze. Naruto took a shaky step forward, his boot making no sound on the unnaturally smooth surface. He reached out a trembling hand and touched the pillar of ice that was Sasuke. It wasn't cold. That was the most terrifying part. It was not cold, or hot, or textured. It was nothing. It was the physical manifestation of a void. When his fingers touched it, he felt no transfer of heat, no friction, no reality. It was like touching a hole in the world. His power. He had done this. A wave of nausea and vertigo washed over him. But it was distant, intellectual. The roaring panic he would have expected was absent. In its place was a chillingly logical assessment. Sasuke is alive. I can feel him. His chakra is stopped. Not gone. Just paused. I need to figure out how to reverse this. Kakashi-sensei is on his way. He'll be here soon. What will I tell him? He looked around. The Valley of the End had become a mausoleum of silence. The monumentality of what he had just done began to settle in. This wasn't ninjutsu. It wasn't a Kekkei Genkai. It felt ancient, fundamental. It felt like he had reached out and commanded the universe to be still, and it had, for a moment, obeyed. And in the heart of that stillness, reality, having been so fundamentally violated, began to tear. It started as a shimmer in the air, right above the point where their fists had met. It was a distortion, like heat haze on a summer road, but there was no heat. The air twisted, warping the image of the frozen waterfall behind it. A sound began to build, a low hum that vibrated not in his ears, but in the bones of his skull. It was the sound of something deeply wrong. The shimmer coalesced, darkening into a ragged, vertical line of midnight black. It wasn't a shadow. It was a slice, an incision in the fabric of the world. The edges crackled with an energy that felt like the opposite of his own, chaotic, unstable, and violent. The tear widened, splitting open with the sound of tearing cloth and breaking glass, revealing not darkness, but an endless, bone-white desert under a black sky. Naruto's new, calm mind instantly categorized it as a threat. He fell into a low defensive stance, a kunai appearing in his hand without a conscious thought. He didn't know what this was, but it was a consequence of his power, and he would face it. The portal, the rift, was a beacon of wrongness, and it pulsed with a strange, alien energy. He could feel it pulling, tugging at the world around it. And then, Something was spat out of it. Rukia Kuchiki drove her Zanpakuto through the throat of the Ajuka's class hollow, the white steel of Soda no Shirayuki's blade hissing as it made contact with the creature's hierro. The hollow, a towering monstrosity of bone and fused sand, gurgled, its sero fizzling out in its gaping maw. It had been a tiresome fight, more a battle of attrition than skill. These hollows in the deeper recesses of Hueco Mundo were stubborn, their hides thick, their spiritual power dense but unrefined. She twisted the blade and kicked off the creature's chest, landing lightly on the pale white sand a dozen yards away. The hollow shuddered, its immense form dissolving into black and red motes of spirit energy that were quickly scattered by the ceaseless, sterile wind of the eternal night. Target designated. Sand maw. Neutralized, she spoke into the air, her voice clipped and professional. A faint crackle from her Denryashinki in the sleeve of her Shihakusho was the only reply she needed. Mission complete. Another patrol, another extermination. It was the monotonous, necessary work of a Shinigami station near the Manos forest. She sheathed Soda no Shirayuki, the elegant white blade disappearing into its scabbard with a soft click. For a moment, she allowed herself to stand still, surveying the unchanging landscape. White sand, black sky, twisted quartz trees that looked like skeletal hands reaching for a non-existent moon. It was a world defined by its emptiness, a place of profound spiritual starvation. The reishi here was thin, stagnant, tasting of dust and despair. She missed the living, breathing vibrancy of the Seraite, even the chaotic energy of the Rukongai. She missed the taste of real air. As she was about to prepare a Senkaimon for her return, a feeling of intense vertigo washed over her. It wasn't physical, it was spiritual. Her senses, honed by decades of training, screamed a silent, piercing alarm. The very fabric of reality around her felt wrong. She looked up. 100 yards away, the space above the sand began to shimmer, then twist. It wasn't a garganta. A garganta was a brutal, straightforward tearing of dimensions. This was different. It was a spiral, a vortex of distorted space that seemed to be folding in on itself, pulling the white sand up in a swirling gyre. It hummed with a power she had never felt before, a strange mixture of utter chaos and a deep, terrifying stillness at its core. What in the name of? She breathed, her hand instinctively going to the hilt of her Zanpakuto. Before she could analyze it further, the vortex exerted its pull. It wasn't a physical suction, it was a spiritual command. It latched onto her soul, her very being, and yanked. The world dissolved into a nauseating smear of white and black. She felt a tearing sensation, as if her spirit body was being ripped from the world, threaded through the eye of a needle, and spat out somewhere else. The transition was agonizing and instantaneous, a lifetime of disorientation compressed into a single, brutal second. She crashed, not onto sand, but onto a surface that was smooth, hard, and shockingly slick. She skidded, her body tumbling gracelessly before her training took over. She tucked, rolled, and came up on one knee, her hand already on her sword, her eyes scanning her new surroundings. The disorientation vanished, replaced by a flood of sensory information that was so overwhelming it was almost painful. The air. It was thick, wet, and so unbelievably alive. It was saturated with a type of spiritual energy she had never encountered, but it was vibrant, teeming with life. With growth, with nature. The scent of pine, wet earth, and ozone filled her lungs. It was intoxicating after the sterile void of Hueco Mundo. Then she processed what she was seeing, and the breath caught in her throat. She was in a deep valley, carved between two colossal stone faces of men she didn't recognize. Everything, the trees, the cliffs, the very air, was covered in a delicate, beautiful, and utterly terrifying layer of frost. A massive waterfall was frozen mid-flow, a titanic sculpture of captured motion. Droplets of water hung suspended in the air around her. It was a scene of impossible, perfect stillness. And at the center of it all, standing between her and a man-shaped pillar of dark ice, was a boy. He was dressed in a tattered orange and black jumpsuit, his blonde hair matted with grime and blood. But it wasn't his appearance that made every instinct she possessed scream threat. It was his spiritual pressure. His Ryutsu. It was immense. Captain level, easily, perhaps even greater. But it had a quality she had never, ever felt. It wasn't the refined, ordered pressure of a Shinigami. It wasn't the hungry, empty pressure of a hollow. It wasn't the proud, hybrid pressure of a Quincy or an Arankar. It was nothing. It felt like a black hole in the spiritual spectrum, a zone of absolute nullity from which all energy, all heat, all motion had been bled away. It was the Ryutsu of an ending. The cold, quiet finality of a dead universe. And it was all emanating from this one boy, who stood there with a stillness that mirrored the frozen world around him. Rukia slowly rose to her feet, her mind racing. What is he? He's human, I think. But no human should have this kind of power. And this phenomenon, it's not Kido. It's not a Zanpakuto ability. It's something else, something fundamental. The boy's head turned, and his eyes met hers. They were a startling, vivid blue, but the usual fire one might expect was gone. They were calm and as deep as a frozen lake. He wasn't looking at her like an enemy to be fought. He was looking at her like a problem to be solved. Naruto saw the woman rise. She was small, dressed in strange black robes that seemed ill-suited for combat, yet she moved with the ingrained grace of a seasoned warrior. A sword was strapped to her back. Her spiritual energy, this, Ryutsu, she was leaking, was sharp and controlled. Like a well-honed blade. It was completely alien to the chakra he knew. She was an unknown variable in an already impossible equation. He had to control this. He saw her hand rest on the hilt of her sword. Her stance was wary, her dark violet eyes narrowed in suspicion and fear. He had to de-escalate. Shouting, his usual tactic, felt wrong. It felt loud, obtrusive. It would violate the quiet clarity he now possessed. He spoke, and his voice surprised him. It was even, measured, and carried easily across the frozen expanse, devoid of his usual boisterous energy. I don't know who you are, or where you came from. He gave a slight nod toward the still open rift behind her. But right now, you have two choices. You can be a threat I have to deal with, or you can be a problem we can solve later. I'd prefer the second. Rukia's eyes widened slightly. The sheer, unshakable confidence in his tone was more intimidating than any shout would have been. He wasn't posturing. He was stating a fact. This boy, who looked no older than she appeared, was speaking to her as if he held all the cards, and the terrifying thing was, in this frozen world he had apparently created, he probably did. She drew Soda no Shirayuki. The blade, renowned as the most beautiful ice-type Zanpakuto in Soul Society, gleamed in the dim light, a sliver of pure white against the oppressive stillness. The irony was not lost on her. You will answer my questions, she said, her voice tight. What is this power? Who are you? Naruto's gaze flickered to her sword, then back to her face. Ice. Her weapon used ice. A pathetic, mundane imitation of the absolute concept he now wielded. It was like comparing a candle to the sun. His newfound perception analyzed her instantly. She was tense, afraid, but disciplined. She was defaulting to her training. Identify, assess, control. My name is Naruto Uzumaki, he said simply. He didn't raise his hands. He didn't drop his kunai. He simply stood, a picture of calm readiness. And this power is new. He looked over at the frozen statue of Sasuke, and for the first time, a flicker of something ancient and sad crossed his face. It's a mistake I have to fix. Before Rukia could press further, Naruto's head snapped up, his gaze directed toward the cliffs overlooking the valley. His new senses, a perfect fusion of Sage Mode's perception and this new, silent clarity, reached out. A chakra signature, familiar and welcome, was approaching fast. Kakashi-sensei. But its arrival would complicate things exponentially. A strange woman with a sword. Sasuke frozen in a pillar of impossible ice, and him, standing at the center of it all. Kakashi would see a fight, a threat. He would attack. And right now, Naruto couldn't afford more chaos. He turned his full attention back to Rukia. My teacher is coming, he said, his voice dropping slightly, becoming more urgent, but no less calm. He's one of the strongest shinobi in my village. When he gets here, he will see you as an enemy. He will try to kill you. I don't want that to happen. So, for the last time, I need you to put the sword away and stand down. We don't have time for this. Rukia felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. The sincerity in his voice was absolute. He wasn't threatening her. He was warning her. He was trying to protect her from a threat she couldn't even see yet. It was so contrary to the terrifying power he radiated that it left her momentarily speechless. Who was this boy, who could wield the power of universal death and yet show concern for a stranger? And why? She challenged, her grip tightening on her hilt. Should I trust a word you say? Naruto's gaze was unflinching. Because out of everything that's happened here today, he said, his voice low and firm. You are the only thing I haven't tried to break. The statement hit her with the force of a physical blow. The honesty in it was brutal, undeniable. She was an anomaly, a footnote in his own personal tragedy. It was in that moment of tense silence, as Rukia weighed the boy's impossible words against the evidence of her senses, that a third party arrived. Kakashi. Hatake moved through the trees like a ghost. The rain had stopped. That was the first thing that felt wrong. The storm had been raging, a physical manifestation of the cataclysmic clash of chakra he had been racing toward. Now, there was only a dead, heavy silence and a bizarre, penetrating cold that his standard-issue flak jacket did nothing to ward off. He felt the chakra signatures of his students flicker and then, abruptly, vanish. Not fade, as if in death. They were just gone. One moment, two enormous, raging infernos of power. The next, nothing. A void. He pushed himself faster, a cold dread coiling in his stomach. It was a feeling he hadn't felt since the night he'd lost his team, so long ago. He burst through the treeline onto the cliff overlooking the valley of the end and stopped dead. His single, visible eye widened, the Sharingan beneath his headband spinning to life on pure, horrified instinct. He tried to process the scene before him, but his mind refused to accept the data his eyes were feeding it. Silence. Absolute, profound silence. The waterfall, the great, roaring testament to the valley's history, was frozen. Not like a winter freeze, with jagged icicles and thick sheets of white. It was a perfect, smooth, gray-blue sculpture of water in motion. The entire valley was coated in a fine, dark frost that seemed to drink the light. The river was a sheet of black glass. And on that glass, there was Sasuke, encased in a column of dark, crystalline material, his pose locked in a desperate lunge. Kakashi's heart seized. Dead. No. I can't sense him at all. It's like he's not there. And then there was Naruto. Standing. His clothes were torn, he was covered in filth, but he stood with a posture Kakashi had never seen before. It was the relaxed, ready stance of a true master. A stillness that spoke of absolute confidence and control. The chaotic, explosive energy that had defined Naruto his entire life was gone, replaced by an aura of deep, unsettling calm. He was holding a kunai. But it didn't look like a threat. It looked like an extension of his will. Facing him was a girl. Small, with black hair and black robes, holding a white katana in a ready stance. She was an unknown. But what terrified Kakashi was the context. His mind, trained for rapid threat assessment, constructed a narrative in a nanosecond. This girl appeared. She did this. She killed Sasuke and is now facing Naruto. Without a word, his hand flew to his pouch. He would end this. He would protect his last remaining student. But before he could even draw a shuriken, Naruto's head tilted slightly. His blue eyes flicking up to meet Kakashi's from across the vast, silent expanse. Sensei. The word was not a shout. It barely disturbed the air, yet it landed in Kakashi's ears with the weight of a command. There was no panic in it. No plea for help. Just an acknowledgement. Naruto then turned his gaze back to the Shinigami girl. He's here. This is your last chance. Kakashi watched, frozen in disbelief. As Naruto took a deliberate step forward, placing himself slightly between the girl and Sasuke's frozen form. It wasn't an aggressive move. It was protective. He was shielding them both. The narrative in Kakashi's head shattered, replaced by utter confusion. He dropped from the cliff, landing silently on the frozen river 100 feet away. The surface was impossibly hard and slick. It felt dead. Naruto, what is this? What have you done? Kakashi's voice was strained, the usual lazy drawl completely absent. Naruto didn't look at him. His focus was entirely on Rukia. Her name is Rukia Kuchiki, he said. The information offered freely. She came through that. He nodded to the shimmering, dying rift. She's not the enemy. Then what happened to Sasuke? Kakashi demanded, taking a step closer. His hand hovering over his pouch. A shadow of pain crossed Naruto's face, so fleeting Kakashi might have missed it if not for his Sharingan. I stopped him, Naruto said. The words heavy with a meaning Kakashi couldn't begin to fathom. He's alive. Just paused. To demonstrate, Naruto lifted his left hand. He focused, not on a massive display of power, but on a single, suspended droplet of rain floating near the girl's shoulder. With a soft, almost inaudible tink, the droplet was released from its stasis. It fell, landing on the shoulder of Rukia's black shihakusho, where it instantly soaked into the fabric. The act was small, precise, and utterly terrifying. It was a demonstration of control so absolute it bordered on the divine. Rukia stared at the wet spot on her shoulder, then back at Naruto. In that one, simple action, he had proven everything. He wasn't a berserker. He wasn't a monster who had lost control. He was the master of this impossible power. He had offered her a choice not because he couldn't beat her, but because he didn't want to. Slowly, deliberately, she lowered her blade. The tip of Soda no Shirayuki touched the frozen surface of the river, and with a soft click, she sheathed her Zanpakuto. She gave a slight, formal nod. It was an acknowledgement, a truce. Naruto's shoulders relaxed by a fraction of an inch. The immediate crisis was averted. He finally turned to face his teacher, his blue eyes holding Kakashi's gaze. The look in them was one of profound exhaustion, but also of a startling, newfound maturity. The loud, spurrate boy Kakashi had trained was gone, lost somewhere in the silence of this frozen valley. In his place stood a young man burdened by a power that defied all reason. "Sensei," Naruto said, his voice quiet but firm, resonating in the unnatural stillness. "We have a lot to talk about." Kakashi looked from his changed student, to the frozen form of his other, to the alien swordswoman now standing in a tense, watchful peace. He looked at the impossible landscape, a testament to a power he couldn't comprehend. Nothing in his life, not the Anbu, not the Sharingan, not the loss of his entire world, had prepared him for this. The silence of the valley pressed in on them all, a quiet, heavy blanket over a world forever changed. Chapter 1 End. Chapter 2. A stranger in a strange leaf. The fragile truce hung in the silent air, as thin and sharp as a shard of glass. Kakashi's visible eye flicked between Naruto, whose stillness was a louder declaration of power than any shout, and the strange, dark, robed woman who had conceded with a grace that spoke of high breeding and hard training. His mind, a finely tuned instrument for tactical analysis, was failing. There were too many variables that didn't compute: the frozen waterfall, the suspended rain, the solid river, the crystalline prison that held Sasuke, and the complete, utter transformation of his most volatile student. "Talk," Kakashi finally said, his voice strained. It was a command born of desperation. Naruto gave a slow, deliberate nod. "Here isn't the place." His gaze swept over the impossible tableau he had created. "I need to get Sasuke back to the village. And her." He gestured to Rukia. "She's a complication, but leaving her here isn't an option. That thing she came through." He looked at the rift, which was now shrinking, flickering like a dying candle flame. "It feels unstable. I don't know what's on the other side, but I know I don't want it coming here." His logic was cold, simple, and irrefutable. Kakashi found himself nodding before he'd fully processed the words. The authority radiating from Naruto was a force in itself. This wasn't the knucklehead who'd charge in without a plan. This was someone assessing a strategic situation. "How do we move him?" Kakashi asked, his eyes drawn to Sasuke's frozen form. The question felt absurd. How do you move a statue that his Sharingan told him wasn't made of any recognizable matter? Naruto walked toward Sasuke, his footsteps making no sound on the glassy surface. He placed a hand on the dark ice of Sasuke's shoulder. "I'm not sure," he admitted, his voice quiet. The calm facade finally showed a crack of uncertainty. "The stasis is anchored to me. I think I have to carry him. If I get too far away, I don't know what will happen. It might collapse. It might shatter." The last word was barely a whisper, laden with a horror that was all the more potent for its quiet delivery. The physical weight of his actions was now literal. He would have to carry his failure, his victory, his burden, all the way home. He braced himself, sliding one arm under Sasuke's frozen legs and the other around his back. The pillar of ice was surprisingly light, as if its Physical properties were just as confused as its metaphysical ones. With a grunt that was more about centering himself than exertion, he lifted Sasuke into his arms. The image was a grotesque parody of a hero carrying a fallen comrade. Sasuke wasn't wounded. He was an artifact, a piece of a moment trapped in time. Naruto turned, the weight of his friend held securely. "Let's go," he said to Kakashi. Then his blue eyes, clear and direct, settled on Rukia. "You, with us, no tricks. If you try to run, I won't have to chase you." He didn't elaborate. He didn't need to. The implication was clear. His power had a reach. Rukia gave a stiff, almost imperceptible nod. She was a guest in a madman's gallery, and the artist was her only guide. She fell into step behind Kakashi, her senses on high alert. She watched the blonde boy, Naruto. He moved with a steady, unhurried gait, carrying the frozen effigy of his friend as if it were a normal, everyday occurrence. The spiritual pressure emanating from him wasn't a roar anymore. It was a low, constant hum, the sound of a vast and silent engine operating at idle. It terrified her more than any battle cry. The journey back was a silent procession. Kakashi led the way, his mind a whirlwind of reports he would have to file, questions he couldn't answer, and a deep, paternal fear for the boy walking behind him. Naruto followed, his focus narrowed to the single, all-consuming task of maintaining the delicate stasis field around Sasuke. It was a strange, intimate connection. He could feel Sasuke's presence, not his chakra, but his very existence. Held in a fragile equilibrium by his will alone. It was a constant, draining hum in the back of his mind. Rukia brought up the rear, a silent, watchful captive. This world was a sensory overload. The sheer vitality of the trees, the smell of the damp earth, the chorus of unseen insects, it was all so different from the stark realities of Soul Society and Hueco Mundo. These people called their energy, chakra. It felt raw, unrefined, yet potent, like a wilder form of Raryoku. And the one in front of her, Naruto, wielded a power that seemed to stand above it all, a law unto itself. They reached the great gates of Konohagakure as the first hints of dawn painted the sky in shades of bruised purple and soft gray. Azumo and Katetsu, the perennial guards, were slumped in their chairs, bored. They straightened up instantly as Kakashi appeared, but their professional demeanors crumbled as they saw what followed him. "Kakashi-san," Azumo started, his eyes wide. "Lord Hokage was, and what in the—" His voice died as he took in the full sight. Naruto Uzumaki, the village pariah and hero, looking grim and older than his years, carrying what looked like a perfectly crafted ice sculpture of the village's last Uchiha. And behind him, a small woman in strange black robes with a sword, her face a mask of wary neutrality. "As that, Uchiha Sasuke?" Katetsu stammered, taking a half step back. "Is he?" Naruto didn't break his stride. He walked past them, his voice low and devoid of any emotion but sheer command. "Get the Hokage. Tell her to meet me at the hospital. Secure wing. Now." The guards, accustomed to Naruto's boisterous and often ignored declarations, found themselves snapping to attention. The order hadn't been shouted. It had been delivered with the calm, unshakable weight of a cage. Azumo sprinted off into the village without a second thought, his heart pounding. Katetsu simply stared, his mouth agape, as the bizarre procession disappeared down the street. The Naruto who just passed him was not the boy he knew. The sterile white of Konoha Hospital's secure ward was a stark contrast to the organic chaos of the valley. Sasuke's frozen form was laid on a reinforced medical bed, the dark, crystalline material of his prison seeming to absorb the harsh fluorescent light above. The air around the bed was unnaturally still and held no chill. Tsunade, fifth Hokage, stood with her arms crossed, her brow furrowed in a deep, frustrated scowl. Shizune stood beside her, looking pale, while a team of Konoha's most elite medical nin hovered uselessly. "It makes no sense," one of the medics reported, wiping sweat from his brow despite the lack of heat. "There's no temperature drop. Our thermal scan jutsu show it at ambient room temperature. But it won't respond to anything. We tried a low-level fire jutsu. The flames bent around it. We tried to take a sample with a chakra-infused scalpel, the blade wouldn't even scratch it. It's like it isn't really there." Tsunade stepped forward, her own hands glowing with the green light of the mystical palm technique. She hesitated for a moment, then pressed her palms against the side of the crystalline pillar. Her expression shifted from frustration to disbelief. "There's nothing," she murmured, her voice laced with awe and fear. "No chakra, no cellular structure, no physical resistance. It's like trying to heal a concept. But I can feel him. He's in there. His life force is suspended." She turned her furious, frightened gaze on the only person in the room who wasn't confused. Naruto stood by the door, 2 Anbu guards flanking him. He hadn't moved since he'd laid Sasuke down. His expression was placid, his eyes distant. "Naruto, what is this?" she demanded, her voice echoing in the tense room. "What did you do to him?" "I stopped him from leaving," Naruto replied simply, his voice a low counterpoint to her shout. "And from killing me. He's not hurt, Granny Tsunade. He's just on pause." "On pause," Tsunade scoffed, her fear manifesting as anger. "This is beyond any ninjutsu, any Kekkei Genkai I've ever seen or read about. How do we reverse it?" Naruto's gaze finally met hers. "You don't. I do." He took a step forward. "I'm the only one who can. I have to stay close to him. The field is stable, but I'm its anchor. If I leave the village, if something happens to me," he didn't finish the sentence. The implication hung in the air. Heavier than any threat, Tsunade's fists clenched. The tactical nightmare of the situation crashed down on her. Her most powerful Jinchuriki was now a living leash for the last Uchiha. Bound by a force none of them understood. And there was still the other variable. "And the girl," she bit out. "She's in interrogation room 3, Kakashi supplied, stepping out of the shadows from the corner of the room. "She hasn't said a word. She's waiting." "Waiting for what?" Tsunade snapped. "For someone to ask the right questions, I imagine," came a new voice. Jiraiya, the Toad Sage, appeared in the doorway. His usual jovial expression replaced by one of intense, sober curiosity. He looked from the frozen Sasuke to his godson. "Naruto, you've had a busy day." Naruto just nodded, his eyes never leaving Sasuke. He was a sentinel now, guarding a prison of his own making. The interrogation room was a sterile cube of gray metal and one-way glass. It was designed to intimidate, to isolate, to break a person down. Rukia Kuchiki sat on the simple metal chair, her posture perfect, her hands resting on her knees. She was the picture of noble calm, a stark contrast to the room's purpose. She had seen worse in the headquarters of the Onmitsukido. The door slid open, and Tsunade entered, followed by Jiraiya. Rukia's eyes, sharp and analytical, assessed them immediately. The woman was the leader. Her power immense and thrumming just beneath her skin, but her demeanor was frayed, stretched thin by a crisis she couldn't punch her way out of. The white-haired man was different. He was older, his power vast and ancient, but his eyes held a keen intelligence and a flicker of something she recognized, the insatiable curiosity of a scholar. He was the one to talk to. "I am Tsunade, Hokage of this village," the woman began, her voice all business. "You will tell me who you are, where you came from, and what your connection is to Naruto Uzumaki." Rukia met her gaze without flinching. "My name is Rukia Kuchiki. Where I came from is complicated. My connection to Naruto Uzumaki is that I was inadvertently pulled here by the same event that caused that," she gestured vaguely in the direction of the hospital. "Complicated won't cut it," Tsunade growled. "Perhaps a different approach is in order," Jiraiya interjected smoothly, pulling up a chair and sitting opposite Rukia. Treating it like a casual chat. "My name is Jiraiya. Now, Rukia-san, that energy you use, it's not chakra. It feels more spiritual, refined. Tell me about it." Rukia paused, surprised by his perception. "It is called Raryoku," she said, her tone formal. "I am a Shinigami, a soul reaper." Tsunade snorted. "A god of death. You're a little short for a god." Rukia's eyebrow twitched in irritation, a flicker of her usual personality breaking through her noble composure. "It is a title, not a literal description. We are balancers. We guide the souls of the deceased, a process we call Kanso, to our world, the Soul Society. And we cleanse hollows, corrupted souls who prey on the living and the dead." Jiraiya leaned forward, his eyes alight. "Hollows, Soul Society, fascinating. You're saying there's an entire world, an afterlife, running parallel to our own." "There are several worlds," The world of the living, where we are now. The Soul Society, my home. And Hueco Mundo, the realm of hollows. It was from there that I was taken. Rukia explained the basic cosmology, her voice crisp and efficient. She described the Gote 13, the structure of the Seraite, the duties of a Shinigami. It was a lecture, a report she might give to a superior, delivered to two people whose worldview was being systematically dismantled. Tsunade listened with mounting skepticism. Gods, souls, other dimensions. It sounded like a madman's fairy tale. And you expect us to believe this? Rukia met her gaze, her expression turning cool. You have a boy in your hospital encased in a substance that defies your laws of physics. You have a boy in your custody who can command reality to stop. You saw me arrive through a tear in the sky. Given the circumstances, perhaps you should consider that your understanding of the world is incomplete. Her words struck home. Tsunade fell silent, chewing on the inside of her cheek. Jiraiya, however, was grinning. I like her. She's got spunk. He turned back to Rukia. All right, let's say we believe you. This power of Naruto's, have you ever seen anything like it? Rukia's expression became grave. Never. The energy he radiates, the effect he produces, it is absolute. In my world, we have Zanpakuto, swords that are manifestations of our souls. Some wield elements. Mine commands ice. Tsunade scoffed. Ice. We have shinobi who can use ice. No, Rukia said, her voice dropping, carrying a weight of authority that silenced the Hokage. Your shinobi create ice. They lower the temperature of water until it freezes. My Zanpakuto, Soda no Shirayuki, in its ultimate form, can achieve a temperature of absolute zero. But even that is merely the cessation of kinetic energy in matter. What that boy did, she shuddered, a genuine, involuntary tremor. He didn't freeze the world. He commanded it to be still. He froze motion itself. It is not an elemental power. It is a conceptual one. It is the power a god might wield to unmake creation. The room was silent for a long moment, the weight of her words settling over them. Jiraiya's smile was gone, replaced by a deep, troubled seriousness. He had felt it, too. The unnatural wrongness in the valley. We need proof, Tsunade said finally. Her voice strained. Of your abilities, and a demonstration of his. Controlled. Training Ground 44, the Forest of Death, was the perfect venue. Its towering, menacing trees and dark reputation ensured it was always deserted. Tsunade, Jiraiya, and a silent, brooding Danzo Shimura stood in a clearing. Kakashi watched from the branches of a nearby tree, a silent shadow. Rukia was brought forward first. You claim to use this, Kido, Tsunade stated. Show us. Rukia nodded. She raised a hand, her expression focused. Hado number 31, Shakaho. She incanted. A sphere of brilliant red energy formed in her palm and shot across the clearing, slamming into a thick tree trunk. It exploded with a concussive boom, blasting a blackened, crater-sized hole through the wood. Danzo's single eye widened fractionally. It wasn't a fireball jutsu. There was no elemental transformation. It was pure, concussive force, born from nothing but an incantation. It was proof of a different system of power. Satisfied, Rukia asked, her tone dry. Tsunade just grunted. Naruto, you're next. Naruto stepped forward. He looked at the massive, scarred training dummies at the edge of the clearing. He had spent countless hours here as a child, beating them senseless, pretending they were enemies he could actually defeat. Now, he felt nothing toward them. What do you want me to do? He asked, his voice calm. Show us, Danzo said, his voice a dry rasp. Show us the power you used on the Uchiha. Naruto's eyes hardened at the mention of Sasuke. He turned and walked toward the largest dummy. A massive log figure scarred with kunai marks and scorches. He didn't perform any hand signs. He didn't gather chakra. He simply placed his hand on the center of its wooden chest. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, a wave of visible distortion, like a heat haze in reverse, pulsed from his palm. There was no sound. A frost, not white but the color of twilight, spread across the dummy's surface. It didn't crackle or hiss. It simply appeared. The frost crept over the entire dummy, covering it in a thin, ethereal sheath. Then, it faded, leaving the wood looking completely unchanged. Is that it? Danzo sneered. A light frost. Don't touch it, Naruto warned, not turning around. Jiraiya, his curiosity overriding his caution, stepped forward. He reached out a hand, his fingers hovering over the wood. He could feel no cold radiating from it. It seemed perfectly normal. He pressed his fingertips against the surface. And his breath hitched. There was no sensation, no texture of wood grain, no temperature, no resistance. His fingers, which could feel the subtle shifts in nature's own energy, felt nothing. It was a void, a hole in the shape of a training dummy. He snatched his hand back as if burned, staring at his fingers in horror. What was that? He whispered, his voice shaking slightly. The bonds between its molecules have been suspended, Naruto explained, his voice distant, as if reciting something from a book he was only just beginning to understand. It has form, it has mass, but it has no kinetic energy. It has no temperature. It's at a perfect state of stillness. Absolute zero. Danzo's one visible eye was wide now, the initial avarice tainted with a healthy dose of primal fear. This was not a weapon you could aim. It was a philosophy that you could inflict upon the world. He saw its potential immediately. An unbreachable defense. An unstoppable assassination tool that left no trace. A prison from which there was no escape. He had to control it. He had to control the boy. Tsunade looked pale. She was a woman of science, of medicine. She understood the world in terms of cells, chakra, and physical laws. What she had just witnessed was a violation of all three. It was magic. It was godhood. And it resided in the hands of the most unpredictable, emotionally volatile boy she knew. Or who he used to be. The Anbu guards stationed outside Sasuke's room were a permanent fixture now. Inside, the silence was thick and heavy. Naruto sat in a chair by the bed, his hand resting on the dark, crystalline prison. He had discovered that by touching it, he could more easily regulate the stasis, a silent communion with the power he had unleashed. It was exhausting, a constant, low-level drain on his mind. The door opened, and Rukia was escorted in. The guards closed the door behind her, leaving them alone. An unspoken agreement had been reached. She was no longer a prisoner, but a consultant. A fellow anomaly. She stood for a moment, looking at the frozen form of Sasuke. His face, locked in that expression of furious shock, was a chilling sight. Is he aware? She asked softly. No, Naruto said without looking up. I don't think so. There's nothing to be aware of. Time has stopped for him. He's in the moment before the moment. He'll stay that way until I can figure out how to let him go. Rukia pulled the room's other chair closer, her movements quiet and deliberate. That power, it's a heavy burden to bear. Naruto finally looked at her. Her violet eyes held not pity, but a quiet understanding. It was a look he hadn't seen from anyone else. Kakashi looked at him with fear. Jiraiya with academic fascination. Tsunade with strategic worry. But this stranger, this soul reaper, looked at him with something akin to empathy. You're one to talk, he said. A ghost of his old retort, but without the bite. God of death. A small, sad smile touched her lips. It's a duty, a responsibility passed down, not a force you awakened by trying to save your friend. She looked at Sasuke again. You care for him a great deal. He's my brother, Naruto said, the words simple and solid. The only one I have. He wanted to throw that away for power. I couldn't let him. He paused, his gaze becoming distant. I thought I'd have to break his arms and legs to stop him. I would have. But then, this happened. I just wanted everything to stop hurting. And it did. The confession hung in the air. It was the first time he'd articulated the why. It wasn't about winning. It was about ending the pain. I understand, Rukia said, and he knew she did. She spoke of her own world. Of the pressures of her noble family, the Kuchiki clan. The expectations, the cold distance of her adoptive brother, Byakuya. The loneliness of duty. They were two very different people from two very different worlds, but in that sterile hospital room, they found a startling patch of common ground. They were both defined by powers and responsibilities that set them apart. The Jinchuriki who held a demon, and the noble who served death. Both were isolated, misunderstood, and carrying burdens far too heavy for their years. For the first time since he'd stood in the Silent Valley, a genuine, small smile touched Naruto's lips. It didn't quite reach his eyes, but it was a start. A flicker of warmth in the encroaching cold. "Rukia," he said, testing her name. "Naruto," she replied, her own voice a little softer. They sat in silence, two lonely souls watching over a boy trapped in time, a fragile bond forming in the quiet heart of a world-altering storm. Far away, in a dimension of pristine white structures and ordered spiritual energy, the instruments in the 12th Division's Seraite Research and Development Institute were screaming. Alarms, Caleb, rated to detect known spiritual phenomena, had been blaring for hours, their alerts routed to a secure server because they didn't match any known signature. A frantic, low-ranking officer burst into a minimalist office, his hands clutching a data scroll. The room was stark, decorated only with a single piece of calligraphy that read, "Balance." Behind a dark mahogany desk sat a man who looked like a sterner, more severe version of Rukia Kuchiki. He wore the pristine white hourie of a captain, but it was cut differently, with a high collar and silver clasps, and the symbol on the back was not a squad number, but a perfectly balanced scale. This was Koga Kuchiki, Captain Commander of the Reclusive Divine Balance Division, a unit that answered only to the Central 46 and was whispered to be true enforcement arm of the Soul King's will. "Captain Commander Koga," the officer stammered, "the anomaly from the border of Hueco Mundo. We've analyzed the energy signature." Koga didn't look up from the report he was reading, and his voice was cold, sharp, and utterly devoid of emotion. "Sir, it's nothing. It's a void signature, a temporal spatial event with a corresponding spiritual value of absolute null. We've cross-referenced every known Kido, every recorded Bankai, every Hollow and Quincy ability. There is no match. It is a power that, by all rights, should not exist." The officer swallowed hard. "There's more, sir. The disappearance of Officer Rukia Kuchiki coincides exactly with the timing and location of the event." Now, Koga looked up. His eyes, a piercing shade of gray, were like chips of ice. A Kuchiki, his clan, a noble, a guardian of the balance, was involved in this contamination. It was an intolerable stain. He stood, his presence filling the room with an oppressive, orderly pressure. He walked to a large window overlooking a serene, perfectly manicured garden. "A power that should not exist," he mused, his voice a low whisper. "A tear between worlds. A missing officer of a great noble house. This is not a mystery to be studied. It is a disease, a cosmic imbalance introduced into the system." He turned, his cold gaze pinning the terrified subordinate to the spot. "The purpose of the universe is balance. Order. This event, and whatever created it, is a monument to chaos. A threat to the very foundation of the Soul King's creation." His decision was instantaneous. His purpose, absolute. "An imbalance of this magnitude cannot be observed," Koga Kuchiki declared, his voice ringing with the conviction of a zealot. "It must be excised. Prepare the purgation detail. We are making a trip to the world of the living." Chapter 2 End. Chapter 3. The Scent of the Hollow. The quiet that had settled over Naruto's life was a fragile thing. It was the calm of a deep ocean, peaceful on the surface but with the crushing weight of the abyss just beneath. 2 weeks passed in a monotonous rhythm of silent vigils. Days were spent in Sasuke's hospital room, and resting on the unfeeling crystal of his prison, the constant, low-level hum of the stasis field a permanent background noise in Naruto's mind. Nights were spent in his own apartment, a space that now felt too large and too empty. The silence there less peaceful and more like a prelude to a scream. He trained, but not in the ways he used to. He couldn't create 1,000 shadow clones anymore. The mental focus required to maintain Sasuke's stasis was too great. Throwing a Rasengan felt like a clumsy, brutish act. His new power wasn't about force. It was about will. He would sit for hours under the memorial stone, a place he once avoided, and simply be. He would focus on the world around him, not with Sage Mode's vibrant connection to nature, but with his new, chilling perception. He would isolate a single leaf on a branch and command the dew on its surface to still, watching as it hung in a perfect, unfalling droplet until he released it. He practiced control, precision, the art of doing as little as possible to achieve the greatest effect. His presence in the village had changed. The whispers that once followed him, full of fear and hatred for the demon fox, were now tinged with a new kind of awe and terror. They saw him walking the streets, his expression placid, his eyes distant, and they didn't see the Jinchuriki anymore. They saw the boy who had frozen an Uchiha. The stories, warped and exaggerated, painted him as a new kind of monster, a silent, cold god who could turn you to ice with a look. The fear was different, but the isolation was the same. Only a few people dared to breach that isolation. Kakashi would bring him meals, sitting with him in comfortable silence, offering no advice, just presence. Jiraiya would visit, peppering him with endless questions about his power, treating him like the most fascinating research project of his life. And Rukia was different. She had been given quarters in the Anbu barracks, a guest, who was not allowed to leave the village. She became a fixture in Sasuke's hospital room. She would bring scrolls on Soul Society history and law, reading them aloud not for his benefit, but for her own, her crisp voice a welcome intrusion into the oppressive silence. She told him stories of the Rukongai, of her friends in the 13th Court Guard squads. In return, he found himself talking about his own life, about Team 7. About his dream of being Hokage, a dream that now felt distant and strangely hollow. They were an odd pair. The boy who radiated an impossible cold and the woman whose soul was a blade of ice. They found a strange camaraderie in their shared otherness. She didn't look at him with fear or avarice. She looked at him with the discerning eye of a fellow warrior, one who understood the weight of a power that defined you. You were letting it consume you, she said one afternoon, her gaze sharp as she looked at him from across the hospital room. He was staring at Sasuke, his expression blank. I have to, he replied, his voice flat. It's the only thing holding him together. I don't mean the stasis, she clarified, setting her scroll aside. I mean the stillness. You're letting it seep into you. This isn't who you are, Naruto. I've heard the stories. The loud, unpredictable, ridiculously bright idiot. A flicker of annoyance broke through his placid exterior. I'm not an idiot. My point exactly, she said, a small, triumphant smile playing on her lips. That boy would be climbing the walls, trying a million stupid things to fix this. You've just accepted it. You're letting the a tour of your power become the nature of your soul. That is a dangerous path. A Zanpakuto can influence its wielder's personality, but a Shinigami who becomes their sword is no longer a Shinigami. They are just a weapon. Her words hit him harder than any punch. He had been so focused on controlling the power that he hadn't realized it was controlling him. The quiet wasn't peace, it was apathy. The calm wasn't confidence, it was resignation. He looked at his hand on Sasuke's prison. He wasn't just maintaining the stasis. He was becoming it. Before he could respond, a frantic knock echoed on the door. It slid open to reveal a flustered-looking Iruka, his Chunin vest askew. Naruto, Lady Tsunade needs you. Emergency summons. Iruka's eyes flickered to the frozen Sasuke, then to the strange woman sitting with Naruto. And he visibly swallowed. All of you. Hokage's office. Now. The atmosphere in the Hokage's office was thick with tension. Tsunade stood behind her desk, her face grim. Shizune was wringing her hands. And on the desk, a map of the Land of Fire was spread out, marked with several ominous red circles. What's going on, Granny Tsunade? Naruto asked, his calm demeanor already starting to crack under the urgency of the situation. Rukia stood beside him, her hand resting subconsciously on the hilt of her sheathed Zanpakuto. We've had reports from 3 separate farming settlements near the border, Tsunade said, her voice tight. All within the last 12 hours. The same story from the survivors. People vanishing. Livestock found torn apart. Strange, monstrous screams in the night. The scout teams we sent to the first location found this. She pushed a photograph across the desk. It was a picture of a large, white, bone-like mask, vaguely skull-shaped but with grotesque, elongated features. It was shattered, lying in the dirt of a ransacked village square. Naruto frowned. What is it? Some kind of Anbu mask? Rukia's breath caught in her throat. She stepped forward, her eyes wide with dawning horror as she stared at the photograph. No, she whispered, her voice barely audible. It can't be. You recognize this? Jiraiya asked, his voice sharp. I do, Rukia said, her face pale. This is the mask of a hollow. Tsunade slammed her fist on the desk, making the scrolls and inkwells jump. Damn it, I knew it. That rip in the sky you came through, it wasn't just a one-way trip. Rukia's mind was racing, connecting the dots with chilling speed. The rift, it was created by a massive surge of spiritual power. Even if it's closed, it would have left a wound. A weakness in the barrier between worlds. And the energy signature would be a beacon. Hollows are drawn to sources of high spiritual power like moths to a flame. They're drawn to souls. And this world, she looked out the window at the vibrant, bustling village, is teeming with them. Unprotected souls. A cold dread washed over Naruto. This was his fault. The rift, the power, it was all him. Now, because of him, innocent people were being hunted by monsters they couldn't even see. The stillness he had embraced felt like a coward's shield. Rukia's words from earlier echoed in his mind. You're just a weapon. What do we do? He asked, his voice now tight with a familiar, fiery urgency. The calm was gone, replaced by the burning need to act. Most shinobi can't see them, let alone harm them, Rukia explained rapidly. Their bodies are composed of high-density spirit particles. Your physical attacks and most of your ninjutsu will pass right through them. Only attacks infused with immense, purified energy, or techniques that target the soul itself, have any effect. So, what? We're defenseless, Tsunade demanded. No, Naruto said, his voice ringing with a newfound conviction. He looked at Rukia. She can fight them, and I can. He wasn't sure how he knew, but he was certain. His power didn't just affect matter. It affected existence. A hollow, no matter how spiritual, still existed. And anything that existed, moved. Anything that moved, he could stop. Tsunade looked at him, then at Rukia. A desperate, high-risk plan began to form in her mind. The third and most recent attack was at the Tanzaku quarters. It's a small trade town just beyond the border. The reports are only an hour old. They might still be there. She stabbed a finger at the map. I'm sending Team Kakashi. Sai is with them. His ink beasts are formed from chakra and might be able to physically interact with them. Sakura is one of my best medics. Kakashi will provide command. She then looked directly at Naruto and Rukia. And you two are going with them. You are the only ones who know what you're facing. Naruto, you are the cause of this problem. You will be part of the solution. The command was a release. The burden of his power suddenly had a purpose beyond being a jailer. He felt a surge of the old Naruto, the one who ran headfirst into danger to protect others. But what about Sasuke? He asked, the familiar weight of his responsibility settling back on him. I'll go with you, Jiraiya said, stepping forward. My sealing jutsu can create a stasis field that can temporarily mimic the effects of your power. At least enough to keep the Uchiha stable. It's a drain, but it'll hold for a day or two. It's the best we can do. You're needed in the field, kid. Naruto nodded, AF. Fierce determination hardening his features. He was done sitting. He was done being still. The Tanzaku quarters was a town known for its lively markets and rowdy gambling dens, a place Jiraiya and Tsunade had frequented in their younger years. As Team Kakashi approached, however, there was no sound of laughter or commerce. There was only an eerie, unnatural silence, broken by a cold wind that rustled through empty market stalls. The team moved through the deserted main street, their senses on high alert. Kakashi led, his Sharingan active. Sakura followed, her eyes scanning for any wounded. Sai brought up the rear, his face an unreadable, placid mask. Naruto and Rukia moved in the center of the formation, their own senses tuned to a different frequency. I don't see anything, Sakura whispered, her voice tight with tension. No bodies, no blood. It's just empty. They don't always eat the body, Rukia murmured, her voice low. They're after the soul. Sometimes, all that's left is a husk. Sai's head tilted. You can see them now. Not yet, Rukia said. But I can feel them. It's like the scent of ozone before a storm. The air is thick with their spiritual residue. They were here, many of them. Naruto's perception agreed. The world felt stained. Patches of lingering wrongness clung to the buildings and alleyways, the spiritual spoor of predators. The stillness he had cultivated was now a razor-sharp sensor. He could feel the lingering echoes of chaotic energy, the opposite of his own power. They found the first victim in the town square. A woman, slumped against a fountain, her eyes wide and vacant. A look of ultimate terror frozen on her face. Her clothes were untouched, her body unharmed. But she was utterly, terrifyingly empty. Sakura rushed to her, her hands glowing green. "There's nothing." Sakura choked out, her medical expertise failing her. "No pulse, no respiration, no brain activity, but there's no sign of death. It's like she's just switched off. Her soul has been devoured," Rukia said grimly. "This is the work of a hollow." Suddenly, a high-pitched, unearthly shriek echoed from a side alley. It was a sound that scraped at the nerves, a chorus of pain and hunger. "There!" Rukia yelled, already moving. The team followed, bursting into a narrow alleyway to a scene from a nightmare. 3 monstrous creatures were cornering a small family, a father, a mother, and a young child, who were pressed against a brick wall, paralyzed with fear. The creatures were abominations. They were vaguely humanoid, but far too tall and lanky, their bodies covered in white, bone-like armor. Each had a gaping hole in its chest and a grotesque, leering white mask where its face should be. "Hollows!" Rukia shouted, drawing Soda no Shirayuki. "Kakashi-san, your team can't fight them directly. Keep the civilians safe." Kakashi didn't need to be told twice. "Sakura, Sai, defensive positions. Protect the family." Sakura and Sai moved instantly, creating a barrier between the monsters and the terrified people. Sai's brush flew across his scroll. "Ninja art. Super beast scroll." He shouted. 2 large ink lions sprang to life, snarling as they placed themselves in front of the civilians. One of the hollows, its mask resembling a grinning hyena, dismissed the ink beasts with a wave of its clawed hand. It opened its maw, and a crackling ball of red energy began to form. "Sero!" Rukia yelled. "Get down!" The blast of crimson energy shot forward, not as a fireball, but as a pure beam of destructive force. It slammed into the ground where the team had been standing, tearing a smoking furrow in the cobblestones. The sheer power of it made even Kakashi's eye widen. Rukia was a blur of black and white. She shot forward, a flash of motion. "Some no mai, Tsukishiro." First dance, white moon. She swung her blade in a perfect circle, creating a disk of brilliant ice on the ground around the hyena-masked hollow. As the creature took a step, its feet were instantly encased in ice, rooting it to the spot. It was a perfect opening. Naruto saw it instantly. He didn't need a Rasengan. He didn't need a clone. He just needed a single point of contact. He ARED beside the immobilized hollow in a flicker of movement that was almost as fast as Rukia's. The creature turned its masked face toward him, its mindless eyes confused. It had been focused on the Soul Reaper. It hadn't even sensed this new threat. Naruto didn't waste the opportunity. He drove his fist forward, aiming not for the hollow's head, but for the center of its mask. He wasn't channeling chakra for destructive force. He was channeling his will. The moment his knuckles connected with the bone-white surface, there was no crunch of impact. There was only a silent, pulsing wave of that twilight-colored frost. It spread across the mask in a spiderweb of perfect, beautiful cracks. The hollow's shriek was cut off mid-scream. Its red sero fizzled out. For a single, breathtaking second, it was a frozen statue of despair. And then, with a sound like shattering glass, the mask disintegrated into a million motes of dark light. The hollow's body convulsed, then dissolved into black dust, purified by the destruction of its mask. Silence. The other 2 hollows froze, their rudimentary intelligence processing the instantaneous demise of their comrade. Kakashi stared, his Sharingan whirling as it tried and failed to analyze what it had just seen. Naruto hadn't used a powerful jutsu. He had simply touched it, and it had ceased to exist. He purified it. Rukia breathed, her eyes wide with disbelief. She had seen captains destroy hollows with overwhelming power. She had never seen one unmade with such quiet, absolute finality. The moment of shock was broken as the remaining 2 hollows shrieked in unison, their rage overriding their fear. They charged, not at Naruto, but at the weakest-looking targets, the civilians. "Naruto, the other one!" Rukia yelled, as she engaged the closer of the 2, her blade a blur of white steel against its bone-white claws. The second hollow, a lumbering brute with a boar-like mask, ignored her, its single-minded hunger fixed on the whimpering child. It raised a massive, clawed hand, ready to strike down Sai's ink lions and the family behind them. It would never land the blow. Naruto was already there. He hadn't run. He had simply appeared between the hollow and its prey. His back to the family. He didn't even look at the creature. He just raised a hand, palm open. "Stop," he said. The word was not a plea. It was a command. The air in front of his palm shimmered. The hollow's descending claw, a foot away from his hand, halted in midair as if it had struck an invisible wall. But it wasn't a wall. The hollow was still pushing, its muscles straining. But its arm was caught in a localized field of absolute stillness. It was trapped, not by a physical barrier, but by the absence of its own ability to move forward. The hollow let out a frustrated, confused roar. It couldn't comprehend what was happening. Naruto turned his head, his calm blue eyes locking onto the creature's masked face. "You don't belong here," he said, his voice cold and clear. He clenched his fist. The field of stasis collapsed inward. The hollow's arm, its torso, its very existence, was violently and silently crushed into a single point of non-reality. There was no explosion, no gore. The creature simply imploded. One moment it was there, a towering monster of rage and hunger. The next, it was gone, leaving behind only a faint shimmer in the air that quickly faded. Not even dust remained. The silence that followed was heavier than before. The rescued father fell to his knees, clutching his child, sobbing in relief. Sakura and Sai stared, their faces a mixture of awe and terror. Kakashi, perched on a rooftop overlooking the alley, felt a genuine chill run down his spine. He had just witnessed Naruto erase a creature from existence with a word and a gesture. Rukia finished her own fight. With a precise, elegant thrust, she drove Sota no Shirayuki through her opponent's mask, shattering it and purifying the hollow in a shower of dissipating spirit particles. She stood breathing heavily, her blade dripping with black spirit blood, and looked at Naruto. He stood with his back to her, his shoulders slumped slightly. The cost of his power was not physical exhaustion, but a deep, soul-crushing weariness. He had just wielded a power that could unmake reality, and it felt empty. He turned, and their eyes met across the silent, bloodless battlefield. In her gaze, he saw not the fear or confusion of his teammates, but a deep, profound understanding. She had seen the raw, terrible nature of his ability, and she wasn't recoiling. She was looking at him. The person wielding it. "Your control is remarkable," she said, her voice quiet but clear in the alley. "Had to be," he said, his own voice rough. "There was a kid behind me." Their synergy was undeniable. Her knowledge, her speed, her swordsmanship, combined with his overwhelming, reality-bending power. She was the scalpel, he was the singularity. Together, they were not just effective, they were absolute. The experience forged a new layer to their bond, a deep, unspoken respect born in the crucible of combat. Naruto's new leadership, his decisive, protective actions, had earned him not just the awe of his team, but the genuine admiration of the Soul Reaper at his side. He wasn't a monster, he was a guardian, wielding a monstrous power with a hero's heart. As the team began to regroup, tending to the traumatized family, a new sensation pricked at Naruto's and Rukia's senses simultaneously. It was a faint, almost undetectable spiritual residue, different from the hollow's. It was faint, oily, and suffused with a deep, malevolent intelligence. "Did you feel that?" Rukia asked, her eyes narrowed. Naruto nodded, his gaze sweeping the rooftops. "Something else was here. It was watching us." The scent was one of chaos. Not the mindless hunger of a hollow, but the patient, observant chaos of something far older and far more dangerous. It had been here, analyzing them, gauging their strength. On a distant rooftop, a figure cloaked in shadow and illusion smiled, its form indistinct and wavering. It had seen enough. The power of stillness was potent, far more so than its master had anticipated. But it was wielded by a boy with a mortal heart, a heart full of attachments. Full of weaknesses. The herald of Mikabashi faded into nothingness, its mission complete. The data had been gathered. The next phase of the plan could begin. The whispers of chaos were about to get much, much louder. Chapter 3 End. Chapter 4. A brother's decree in a whisper of chaos. The Isshin to the Tanzaku quarters had been a brutal success. They had saved the remaining townsfolk, but the cost was etched into the haunted, empty homes they left behind. The return to Konoha was somber. Kakashi's report to the Hokage was terse and grim, focusing on the horrifying efficiency of the hollows and the equally terrifying efficiency of their only countermeasure, Naruto and Rukia. The dynamic within their small, fractured group had irrevocably shifted. Sakura and Sai looked at Naruto with a new, profound respect that was heavily laced with fear. He was no longer just their teammate, he was a living strategic weapon. A force of nature they couldn't comprehend. They spoke to him with a newfound caution, as if he were a piece of unexploded ordnance. The easy camaraderie of Team 7 was a ghost, replaced by the stark reality of his power. The isolation that Rukia had warned him about was closing in again, but this time it was different. It was the isolation of command, of responsibility. He felt the chasm between himself and his friends widening with every controlled demonstration of his abilities. Only with Rukia did the distance shrink. They fell into a new routine, training together in the desolate forest of death. It was the one place they could unleash their abilities without terrifying the general populace. Rukia would move with the fluid grace of a dancer, her white blade a blur, teaching him the fundamentals of Zanjutsu, the Shinigami art of the sword. "You fight like a brawler," she critiqued, easily parrying a clumsy swing from the wooden bakken he was using. "All your power comes from overwhelming force. But true strength lies in precision, in knowing exactly where and when to cut." Naruto, frustrated, skidded to a halt. "What's the point? I don't need a sword. I can just stop them." "And what happens when you face an enemy you can't stop?" she countered, her violet eyes sharp and serious. "What if you face something that moves too fast, or something that has no physical form to target? Your power is absolute, but your application of it is crude. You rely on a hammer when you might need a needle. Swordsmanship is not just about cutting. It's a discipline. It teaches you economy of motion, focus, and how to read an opponent's intent. It will hone your mind, and your mind is the only thing controlling that abyss inside you." He hated that she was right. His new power gave him incredible perception, but his body and instincts were still those of a headstrong brawler. He was a supercomputer running on outdated software. So he listened, he learned, he practiced the stances, the cuts, the parries. The physical discipline of the sword forms gave him a new way to channel his focus, a welcome respite from the constant, draining hum of maintaining Sasuke's stasis. Their training sessions became the bedrock of their bond. Amidst the sweat and the clash of wood, they talked. He learned the names of the Gote 13 captains, the strictures of the Kuchiki clan, and the story of the man she admired most, a substitute Shinigami with bright orange hair who had turned her world upside down. He, in turn, told her about the academy, about the Chunin exams, about his promise to Sakura to bring Sasuke back, a promise that had led to all of this. In the shared solitude of the forest, away from the fearful eyes of the village, they were just Naruto and Rukia. Two warriors, honing their skills, guarding each other's backs. A fragile, unspoken trust was growing between them, a connection forged in the fires of shared combat and mutual respect. This fragile peace was destined to be shattered. It happened on a clear, bright afternoon. A tremor ran through the very air of Konoha, a deep, spiritual hum that made the birds fall silent and the leaves on the trees rustle without a wind. Naruto and Rukia, who were in the hospital checking on Sasuke, felt it instantly. It was the oppressive, orderly Ryutsu of high-ranking Shinigami. And it was powerful, captain level. Rukia breathed, her face going pale. Her hand instinctively went to her Danryashinki, the small device tucked in her sleeve that served as her link to the Soul Society. It was dead. They had blocked the signal. This wasn't a rescue mission. It was an official incursion. Alarms began to blare across the village. In the sky above the Hokage Tower, a shimmering gate of light tore open. It was not the ragged, chaotic rift that had brought Rukia here. This was a Senkaimon, a formal, perfectly constructed gateway between worlds, its edges crisp and deliberate. Two figures emerged. The first was a tall man with fiery red hair tied in a high ponytail, his body covered in intricate tattoos. He wore the standard shihakusho of a Shinigami, and the white haori over it marked him as a lieutenant. The second figure was instantly recognizable to Rukia, and her heart plummeted into her stomach. He was tall, slender, and moved with a grace that was both regal and deadly. His long, black hair was adorned with the kenseiken, the symbols of the Kuchiki clan's nobility. His face was a mask of aristocratic indifference, but his eyes, a cool, piercing gray, held a depth of power and authority that could quell armies. His captain's haori, bearing the symbol of the 6th Division, billowed slightly in the non-existent wind. Ni-sama, Rukia whispered, the word catching in her throat. Captain Rukia Kuchiki had arrived, and he had brought Renji Abarai with him. Tsunade stood on the roof of the Hokage Tower, flanked by Jiraiya and a squad of her most elite Anbu. She watched as the two Shinigami descended, their spiritual pressure washing over the village like a physical force, making the air thick and hard to breathe. It was an unapologetic display of power, a clear statement of intent. So, Jiraiya said, his arms crossed, his expression grim. The in-laws have arrived. Rukia and Renji landed softly on the roof, their feet making no sound. Renji looked tense, his ND hovering near the hilt of his Zanpakuto, Zabumaru. Rukia's expression was unreadable, his gaze sweeping over the assembled shinobi with cold dismissal before finally landing on Tsunade. I am Rukia Kuchiki, captain of the 6th Division of the Gote 13, he said, his voice as cold and smooth as polished marble. It held no warmth, no room for negotiation. I am here for Rukia Kuchiki. She is a member of my house and a seated officer of my division. Her extended, unsanctioned stay in this world is a breach of Soul Society law. She will return with us. Now, it was not a request. It was a decree. Your officer was instrumental in saving one of our towns from monsters that came from your side of the fence. Tsunade shot back, her own formidable presence rising to meet his. She would not be intimidated in her own village. She is currently under my protection as a guest of Konoha. Rukia's gaze remained unchanged. The appearance of hollows in this world is an anomaly we are investigating. It does not change the fact that Rukia has broken our law. Her continued presence here, consorting with an unknown entity of immense and unstable power, is a further violation. She has forgotten her duty. The insult was clearly aimed at Naruto. Before Tsunade could retort, two figures landed on the roof beside her. It was Naruto and Rukia. Ni-sama, Renji. Rukia gasped, taking a step forward. Rukia, Renji said, his voice a mixture of relief and frustration. What have you gotten yourself into? But Rukia's cold eyes were fixed on the boy standing beside his sister. He saw the tattered orange jumpsuit, the whisker marks, the defiant look in his blue eyes. But beneath that, his highly developed senses felt the terrifying void, the null ryutsu that was a cancer in the spiritual landscape. This was the source of the imbalance. So this is the Ryoka, Rukia said, his voice dripping with disdain. The child who wields a power he does not comprehend. Naruto bristled, stepping forward to stand shoulder to shoulder with Rukia. The calm he had cultivated for weeks was being rapidly eroded by the captain's sheer arrogance. She's not going anywhere, Naruto stated, his voice low and firm. She's helping us. We need her here. Rukia's eyes narrowed fractionally. You have no rights in this matter. You are an anomaly, a danger to the balance of worlds. The fact that I have not been ordered to eliminate you is a testament to the Soul Society's restraint. Do not test it. The threat was naked, undisguised. The Anbu tensed, their hands on their blades. Jiraiya shifted his weight, ready to intervene. Ni-sama, please, Rukia begged. You don't understand. Naruto is not an enemy. His power, it saved us. It's the only thing that can stop the hollows. Silence, Rukia commanded, his voice cutting like a whip. You have consorted with this creature. You have forgotten your place. You have brought shame to the Kuchiki name. Every word was a perfectly aimed dart, striking at Rukia's deepest insecurities. Her sense of duty, her loyalty to her clan, her fear of disappointing the brother she so desperately wanted to please. She flinched as if physically struck, her face paling. Seeing the pain on her face ignited a fire in Naruto's gut. The quiet, contemplative boy was gone, consumed by a wave of protective fury. You talk about shame. Naruto's voice was dangerously quiet, but it cut through the tension like a blade. You stand here, judging her, when she's been fighting to save people you don't even care about. She's more of a hero than you'll ever be, you arrogant bastard. Renji's hand flew to his sword. You dare speak to the captain like that? But Byakuya held up a hand, silencing his lieutenant. A flicker of something that might have been surprise crossed his features. No one had spoken to him like that in centuries. He looked at Naruto, truly looked at him, and saw not just an anomaly, but a boy with a spine of steel, standing defiantly in defense of his sister. It was intriguing and insulting. Your ignorance is matched only by your insolence, Byakuya said, his voice dropping to a dangerously cold whisper. You have no comprehension of the forces you are meddling with. As if on cue, a new presence washed over the rooftop. It was not the orderly, oppressive Ryutsu of a Shinigami. It was something else entirely. Oily, slick, and utterly chaotic. It was the scent of wrongness they had felt in the Tanzaku quarters, but 100 times stronger. The sky above them seemed to darken, the bright afternoon sun dimming as if an unseen cloud had passed over it. The very air grew thick, charged with a malevolent, mocking static. Speaking of meddling forces, Jiraiya murmured, his gaze sweeping the sky. A figure began to coalesce out of thin air in the space between the Konoha shinobi and the Soul Reapers. It had no solid form. It was a shifting, wavering silhouette of shadow and distorted light, a human-shaped hole in reality. Two glowing, crimson eyes, filled with ancient, mocking intelligence, opened within the swirling darkness. How predictable, a voice whispered. It didn't come from the figure, it echoed from everywhere at once, a sibilant, layered sound that scraped at the sanity. The guardians of order, squabbling amongst themselves. So focused on your precious rules, you can't see the wolf that has slipped into your pen. Byakuya and Renji immediately spun into defensive stances, their blades drawn. The Anbu surrounded Tsunade. This new entity radiated an energy that was fundamentally hostile to all life. What is that thing? Renji growled, his eyes wide. It feels like a hollow, Rukia said, her voice trembling slightly. But intelligent and ancient. The creature, the herald, turned its glowing red eyes toward Naruto. The little singularity, the point of stillness in a turning world. Amatsu Mikabashi sends its regards. It finds your very existence offensive. Amatsu Mikabashi. Jiraiya repeated the name, his mind racing through ancient texts and forgotten legends. The August Star of Chaos. A primordial entity of Japanese mythology, said to exist before the gods themselves. A being of pure, endless entropy. He had always dismissed it as a fairy tale. My master grows tired of this reality, the herald whispered, its form beginning to ripple and distort. It is a cage. Too much order. Too much structure. It wishes to unmake it. To return all to the beautiful, screaming chaos of true potential. The red eyes then fixed on Naruto. But you are the antithesis. You are a lock on the cage door. A point of absolute stasis. A cosmic anchor holding this flawed creation together. My master cannot abide that. The world around Naruto suddenly dissolved. The Hokage Tower, his friends, the Soul Reapers, they all vanished. He was standing alone in a sea of blackness, under a sky filled with weeping, blood-red stars. A wave of profound, soul-crushing despair washed over him. You are alone. A voice echoed in his mind, the herald's voice, but twisted with his own deepest fears. It showed him images. The villagers, their faces contorted in hatred, throwing stones at him as a child. Sasuke, walking away from him into the darkness. Jiraiya, looking at him with clinical detachment. Kakashi, his eye wide with fear. His friends, backing away from him in terror. Your power does not bring you closer to them. It pushes them away. You saved your friend only to lose him. You protect your village only to become its new monster. You are a singularity, a point of infinite density and infinite loneliness. You will be alone forever. The illusions were powerful, striking at the very core of his being. The old Naruto would have crumpled, overwhelmed by the pain and the loneliness. But the new Naruto was different. He had been living in stillness. He had faced his own isolation. And he was not alone anymore. He thought of Rukia, her sharp wit, her unyielding sense of duty, her quiet understanding. The look in her eyes in the alleyway, one of mutual respect, not fear. He remembered her words, "You're letting the nature of your power become the nature of your soul." He closed his eyes. The despair was a storm, a chaos of emotion, and he was the stillness at its center. "You're wrong," he said, his voice quiet but absolute. He opened his eyes, and they were no longer just blue. They were the color of a winter sky, clear and cold and utterly unshakable. I'm not alone. A wave of his own power, of pure, conceptual stillness, pulsed outward from him. It wasn't an attack, it was a declaration of will. The dark, illusory world shattered like glass, the blood-red stars cracking and fading. He was back on the Hokage Tower. His friends were still there, locked in battle stances. The herald was reeling back, its shadowy form flickering violently, as if his mental pushback had physically harmed it. Impossible, it hissed. No mortal mind should be able to resist the primordial chaos. I'm not just a mortal, Naruto said, taking a step forward. A thin layer of that twilight frost spread across the rooftop tiles around his feet. The air grew cold, still. I'm Naruto Uzumaki, and you are trespassing in my village. He vanished. One moment he was there, the next he was directly in front of the herald, his hand outstretched, not in a fist, but with his palm open. The herald tried to dematerialize, to fade back into the shadows. It was too slow. Naruto's palm passed through the creature's wavering form as if it were smoke. But he wasn't trying to touch it. He was targeting the chaotic energy that gave it substance. He closed his hand into a fist. Be still, he commanded. The herald froze. Its shadowy form locked in place, the swirling particles of chaos arrested in mid-motion. Its glowing red eyes widened in what could only be described as panic. It was trapped, not in a cage, but in a single moment of time. Naruto's other hand came up, wreathed in the power of the Rasengan. But this Rasengan was different. It wasn't a chaotic sphere of wind. It was a perfect, silent, crystal-clear orb of pure, rotating energy. It held the stillness of his new power, compressed and weaponized. Get out of my home, he snarled, and slammed the silent Rasengan into the herald's frozen form. There was no explosion, no sound. The herald's body simply erased. It collapsed inward, consumed by the dual forces of absolute stillness and perfect rotation, and vanished from existence, leaving nothing behind. The oppressive, chaotic energy vanished. The sun shone brightly again. The world returned to normal. Silence reigned on the rooftop. Everyone stared at Naruto. The Anbu, Jiraiya, Tsunade, Renji, all of them were frozen in shock. He had just faced a being of conceptual horror, resisted a psychic attack that would have shattered a normal mind, and then erased it from reality with a technique they had never seen before. Only two people were not completely stunned. Rukia looked at him with a mixture of awe and profound pride. He had listened. He hadn't just used the hammer. He had used his mind. And Rukia Kuchiki, the captain of the 6th Division, lowered his blade, a look of grudging, almost imperceptible respect in his cold eyes. He had seen the power of the illusion. He knew what it took to resist such a mental assault. This boy, this Ryoka, was more than just a vessel of raw power. He had a will of iron. But that only made him more dangerous. The moment was broken as Rukia sheathed his Zanpakuto with a soft, final click. The sound drew all eyes back to him. The immediate threat was gone, but the original conflict remained. Your display was adequate, Rukia said, his voice returning to its icy monotone. It changes nothing. He turned his gaze to his sister. My decree stands. Rukia, you will come with us. This world is facing a threat beyond its comprehension. It is no place for a member of the Gote 13, let alone a Kuchiki. No, Rukia said, her voice shaking but firm. She took a step, not toward her brother, but to stand beside Naruto once more. She looked him in the eye, then turned her defiant gaze on Rukia. My place is here. My duty is here. These people are under attack from the forces of my world. I will not abandon them. The open defiance, the public choice to stand with the Ryoka over her own family and law, was the ultimate insult. A muscle twitched in Rukia's jaw. Then you are a traitor to the Soul Society, he declared, his voice dropping to absolute zero. And you, he fixed his gaze on Naruto, are the agent of her corruption. He raised a hand, his spiritual pressure skyrocketing, pressing down on them all. I will give you one chance to reconsider. Surrender my sister to me, or I will take her. And I will cut down anyone who stands in my way. The air crackled with tension. The standoff was no longer just a political dispute. It had become a battle of wills, a clash of loyalties, wit. Naruto and Rukia standing united against the unyielding law of the Soul Society. Chapter 4 End. Chapter 5. A duel for acknowledgement. The ultimatum hung in the air, cold and sharp as the edge of a blade. Rukia Kuchiki's spiritual pressure was a physical weight, a declaration of intent that promised swift and merciless retribution. The Anbu squad shifted, their masks betraying nothing, but the tension in their bodies was palpable. Renji stood behind his captain, his hand gripping Zabumaru's hilt so tightly his knuckles were white, his face a storm of conflicting loyalties. He was here to enforce his captain's will. But he was also looking at his oldest friend, Rukia, standing defiant and resolute. Tsunade took a step forward, her own power flaring to life, a golden-green aura of pure chakra that pushed back against the oppressive Ryutsu. "You will not make threats in my village, Captain Kuchiki," she growled, her voice rumbling with the authority of the Hokage. "Rukia is under my protection. If you want her, you'll have to go through the entirety of Konoha." Byakuya's gaze flickered to her, unimpressed. "Your village is an ant-hill in the path of a storm. Do not mistake your localized significance for true power." The sheer, breathtaking arrogance of the statement left Tsunade momentarily speechless, her face flushing with rage. But it was Naruto who broke the standoff. He took a step forward, placing himself directly in Byakuya's line of sight, shielding Rukia. The twilight frost that had coated the tiles around his feet was gone, but the unnatural stillness about him remained. He wasn't radiating power like Tsunade or Byakuya. He was a void, a calm, silent center in the swirling vortex of energy. "This isn't about your laws or her duty," Naruto said, his voice even and clear. Cutting through the tension, he looked at Rukia, saw the fear and determination warring in her eyes, and then turned his gaze back to the stoic captain. "This is about you being afraid to trust her. You think she's weak. You think she made a mistake. You think I'm the mistake." He raised his chin, his blue eyes locking with Byakuya's cold gray ones. "You're wrong. And I'll prove it to you." A murmur went through the assembled shinobi. Jiraiya's eyes widened, a slow grin spreading across his face. This was the Naruto he knew, the one who would always find the most direct, most insane path through any problem. Byakuya raised a perfectly sculpted eyebrow. "Prove it. And how do you propose to do that, Ryoka?" "A duel," Naruto stated, the words simple and absolute. "Me against you. Right here, right now. No one else interferes." He gestured to the wide-open space of the Hokage Monument Plaza behind the tower. "If you win, Rukia goes with you. No argument. Konoha won't stop you. I'll even help you convince her. But if I win," he paused, letting the weight of the impossible, settle. "If I win, she stays. As an official liaison between our worlds. You acknowledge her decision, and you acknowledge me. You leave us in peace to deal with the real threat." The sheer audacity of the proposal was staggering. A genin, a boy who had only just awakened his power, was challenging a captain of the Gote 13. A master of his craft with centuries of experience. It was like a child challenging a hurricane to a fistfight. Renji let out a short, incredulous laugh. "Are you insane? You want to fight Captain Kuchiki? He'll kill you before you can even blink." Rukia grabbed Naruto's arm, her grip tight. "Naruto, no, you can't. You don't know what he's capable of. His Bankai." "I know," Naruto said, not taking his eyes off Byakuya. "I know I'm outmatched in experience, in skill, in technique. But you taught me, didn't you?" He gave her a sidelong glance, a flicker of a confident smile touching his lips. "It's not about overwhelming force. It's about precision, and knowing where to cut." He was throwing her own words back at her, showing her he had listened, that he had learned. He was doing this not just for her, but to prove to her that her faith in him wasn't misplaced. Byakuya was silent for a long moment, his gaze unreadable. He looked at the defiant boy, then at his sister's conflicted face. Then at the assembled shinobi, all watching, waiting. The Ryoka was offering him an elegant solution. A public display of overwhelming force would crush the boy's insolence, retrieve Rukia, and restore the honor of his clan and the authority of the Soul Society in one clean, decisive stroke. To refuse the challenge would be seen as weakness, an admission that he was afraid of this boy's strange power. It was a trap, but it was a trap he had no choice but to walk into. The arrogance of a child playing with a power he has mistaken for a god's, Byakuya said, his voice a low murmur. He drew his Zanpakuto, Senbon Sakura, its blade gleaming in the afternoon sun. Very well, I accept your terms. He turned his cold gaze on Tsunade. You will honor this agreement. Tsunade looked at Naruto, at the unshakable confidence in his eyes. It was a mad gamble, but it was Naruto's gamble. And she had learned, over the years, never to bet against Naruto Uzumaki when he got that look on his face. Konoha will honor the outcome, she confirmed, her voice grim. Ni-sama. No, Rukia pleaded. This is no longer your decision to make, Rukia, Byakuya said, his voice final. He blurred, appearing in the center of the vast, open plaza in a flicker of Shunpo, the Shinigami high-speed movement technique. Come, Ryoka, let me show you the chasm between your power and my own. Naruto gave Rukia's arm a reassuring squeeze. Watch me, he said softly. Then he walked calmly to the opposite end of the plaza, the space between him and the captain a vast, empty stage. The spectators, Tsunade, Jiraiya, Kakashi, Renji, Rukia, and the Anbu, retreated to the edges, forming a circle. This was no longer a political incident, it was a duel of honor, and all of them were now witnesses. The air in the plaza was still. Byakuya stood with his sword held in a formal, two-handed grip, his posture a perfect picture of aristocratic grace and deadly potential. Naruto stood opposite him, empty-handed, his stance relaxed. Almost casual, he looked like a boy waiting for a bus, not a warrior about to face a demigod of death. You fight without a weapon? Byakuya asked, his voice laced with disdain. A foolish choice. I have what I need, Naruto replied calmly. He closed his eyes, taking a deep breath. The world of vibrant, chaotic chakra faded from his perception. He didn't need it. Instead, he reached out with his other sense, the one that felt the quiet hum of existence. He felt the solid stone beneath his feet. He felt the faint whisper of wind curling around the stone faces of the Hokage. He felt the moisture in the air, a trillion tiny droplets invisible to the naked eye. He felt the heat radiating from Byakuya, the kinetic potential coiled in his muscles, the sharp, orderly ryutsu of his drawn blade. He saw the battlefield not as a physical space, but as a web of interconnected energies and possibilities. Then come, Byakuya said, his patience wearing thin. Show me this power you hold in such high esteem. Naruto didn't move, he just opened his eyes. You first. The disrespect was the final straw. Byakuya vanished. His shunpo was a masterclass in speed, so fast that to most of the assembled shinobi, he simply ceased to exist in one place and appeared in another. He reappeared directly behind Naruto, his blade already descending in a silvery arc aimed at Naruto's neck. It was a strike meant to disable, to humiliate, not to kill. But the blade never landed. It stopped, an inch from Naruto's skin, held fast as if it had struck an invisible wall. Byakuya's eyes widened slightly. There was no resistance, no impact. His blade had just stopped moving. Naruto hadn't moved a muscle. He hadn't turned around. But in the space between his neck and Byakuya's sword, he had frozen a single paper-thin plane of reality. A shield of absolute stasis, infinitesimally small, but conceptually absolute. Too slow, Naruto said, his voice quiet. He pivoted on his heel, his movements fluid and precise, echoing the sword forms Rukia had taught him. He wasn't swinging a weapon, he was moving his body like one. He ducked under Byakuya's arm and drove his palm toward the captain's chest. Byakuya, a master of Hakuda, the Shinigami art of unarmed combat, reacted instantly. He released his sword, letting it hang in the stasis field, and spun, deflecting Naruto's palm strike with the back of his gauntlet. But the moment their bodies made contact, he felt it, that same unnatural stillness, creeping up his arm. He disengaged instantly, using another burst of shunpo to put 20 yards between them. He looked at his gauntlet. A thin layer of the twilight frost was spreading across it. It wasn't cold, but it felt dead. The ryutsu he was channeling into it was being nullified. He flexed his spiritual pressure, and the frost shattered into nothingness. His sword, released from the stasis field as Naruto moved away, clattered to the ground. A ripple of shock went through the spectators. Naruto had disarmed Captain Kuchiki in the first exchange. Renji's jaw was hanging open. Rukia's hands were clasped over her mouth, her eyes wide with a mixture of terror and hope. Byakuya's face, for the first time, lost its mask of indifference. It was replaced by a look of cold, serious fury. He had underestimated the boy. Gravely, "You have a degree of crude control," Byakuya admitted. His voice like chipping ice. He raised his blade, which had flown back to his hand. "But you are merely delaying the inevitable." He held his sword out in front of him, the blade pointing downwards. "Scatter," he commanded. The blade of Senbon Sakura dissolved. It didn't break or shatter. It dispersed into a swirling cloud of what looked like a billion tiny, razor-sharp cherry blossom petals. The cloud shimmered in the sunlight, beautiful and utterly lethal. It was his Shikai. Each petal was a microscopic blade, controlled by his will, capable of shredding an opponent from 1,000 different angles at once. The cloud of blades surged toward Naruto, a pink, shimmering tsunami of death. Naruto stood his ground. He didn't try to erect a large shield. That would be a waste of energy. Instead, he watched the approaching swarm, his eyes narrowed, his perception pinpointing not the individual blades, but the currents of wind and ryutsu that guided them. He began to move. It wasn't the explosive speed of Shunpo. It was something else. He flowed through the storm of blades like water. He didn't dodge the swarm. He moved between the individual blades. A half step to the left, a slight tilt of his head. A turn of his shoulder. Each movement was minimal, precise, and perfectly timed. To the onlookers, it looked like the blades were miraculously missing him, passing through him as if he were a ghost. But Kakashi, his Sharingan spinning, saw the truth. Naruto was creating microscopic, momentary pockets of stasis all around his body. A blade would come for his head, and the air an inch in front of it would freeze, causing the blade to halt for a nanosecond, just long enough for Naruto to move past it. Another would aim for his leg, and a single suspended dust mote would become an unmovable obstacle, deflecting its path. He was dancing on raindrops, his control so fine, so absolute, that he could manipulate the battlefield on a microscopic level. "He's not dodging it," Kakashi breathed. His voice filled with awe. "He's rewriting the rules of engagement." Byakuya watched, his fury growing. The boy was making a mockery of his Shikai. He was treating Senbon Sakura not as an unstoppable force, but as an inconvenient storm he could simply walk through. "You are agile," Byakuya conceded, his voice tight. "But you cannot dodge forever." He clenched his fist. The swarm of blades stopped swirling. They converged, forming a dense, compressed sphere of razor-sharp steel around Naruto, leaving him no room to move. It was a perfect cage. "Now, let's see you escape," Byakuya snarled. Inside the sphere of blades, Naruto was calm. He could feel the killing intent from every direction. He was trapped. A brute force breakout was impossible. But Rukia's words echoed in his head again. "A hammer when you might need a needle." He looked at the shimmering wall of death around him. It was made of metal, and the air around him was full of moisture. He smiled. He didn't try to push the sphere away. Instead, he drew the ambient moisture in the air toward the inner surface of the bladed sphere. He didn't freeze it into solid ice. He did something far more subtle. He let the tiny water molecules condense onto each of the billion microscopic blades. The effect was instantaneous. The added mass, minuscule for each individual blade but immense when multiplied by a billion, threw off Byakuya's delicate control. The perfect, humming sphere of death suddenly became heavy, sluggish. The blades began to vibrate, to clang against each other, their aerodynamic properties ruined. The elegant, swirling dance became a clumsy, grinding cage of overweight metal. Byakuya felt the control of his Shikai slipping, the connection suddenly feeling muddy and unresponsive. He poured more ryutsu into it, trying to force the blades to obey, but it was like trying to fly a kite in a hurricane. Naruto seized the moment of imbalance. He didn't shatter the sphere. He simply found the weakest point in the now clumsy formation and pushed. With a screech of grinding metal, a hole tore open in the sphere of blades, and Naruto stepped out, completely unharmed. The crowd of spectators was utterly silent. He hadn't just survived Senbon Sakura. He had neutralized it. He had outthought it. "Is that all?" Naruto asked, his voice genuinely curious. That was it. The final insult. The last shred of Rukia Kuchiki's noble pride and icy composure snapped. "You have forced my hand," Ryoka, he snarled, a terrifying, murderous rage finally burning in his eyes. He let the hilt of his Zanpakuto drop from his hand. It hung in the air before him, and then plunged into the stone plaza as if it were water. Bankai, he whispered, the word a harbinger of untold destruction. The ground rippled. 2 immense rows of colossal blades, each the size of a skyscraper, rose from the ground, flanking the entire plaza. The sheer scale of it was breathtaking, apocalyptic. The world seemed to fall into shadow beneath their presence. Then, with a sound like a million swords being drawn at once, the colossal blades shattered, dissolving into an ocean of hundreds of millions of microscopic blades. The air was thick with them. It wasn't a cloud anymore, it was a sea. A literal ocean of death that blotted out the sun. Senbon Sakura Kajiyoshi, Byakuya intoned, his voice echoing with immense power. Rukia screamed, Naruto, run. You can't fight that. But Naruto didn't run. He stood his ground, looking up at the endless sea of blades with a calm, analytical gaze. He knew he couldn't dodge this. He couldn't trick it. This was overwhelming, absolute force. And absolute force could only be met with an absolute defense. So this is a Bankai, he said to himself, a genuine smile of excitement on his face. Awesome. Byakuya raised his hand. Vanish into dust, he commanded. Gokei. Ma. The entire ocean of blades collapsed inward, forming a single, massive, swirling sphere of pure, destructive power that engulfed Naruto completely. It was not a cage. It was a grinder, a vortex designed to annihilate whatever was at its center, to leave not even dust behind. From the outside, it was a terrifying spectacle of absolute power. A roaring, shimmering sphere of death that filled the center of the plaza. Renji averted his eyes. Rukia fell to her knees, tears streaming down her face. It was over. But inside the storm, it was quiet. Naruto stood at the center of the raging vortex, his eyes closed. He had let the storm come to him. He hadn't tried to stop it. He had let the first avenue of blades get within an inch of his body. And then he had unleashed his power. Not in small, precise bursts. He let it out, a wave of pure, conceptual stillness that expanded into a perfect sphere around him, 10 feet in diameter. It was a zone of absolute zero. The blades that entered this zone did not shatter. They did not slow down. They simply stopped. Their kinetic energy, their very existence as objects in motion, was nullified. They were frozen in time and space, forming a hollow, protective shell of arrested blades around him. As more and more blades from the endless sea poured in, they simply added to the thickness of this shell, their energy consumed by the field of stillness. Naruto stood in the eye of the hurricane, a perfect, quiet sanctuary of his own making, shielded by his enemy's own power. Byakuya felt it. He was pouring an immense amount of his Ryutsu into the attack, but it was like pouring water into a black hole. It was just disappearing. The Gokei was still raging, but its core was silent, inert. The sphere of blades collapsed, the attack ending. The hundreds of millions of blades reformed into the twin rows of giant swords. The dust settled, and Naruto was still standing there, completely untouched, a faint smile on his face. My turn, he said. He did not move. He did not create a weapon. He simply looked at Byakuya, and the world between them changed. Byakuya felt a sudden, inexplicable heaviness. His feet felt rooted to the ground. He tried to use Shunpo, but his body wouldn't respond. It felt sluggish, impossibly heavy. He looked down and saw nothing. But he felt it, a pressure. Naruto was manipulating the very fabric of space-time around him. He was increasing the localized gravity, pinning the captain in place not with a physical force, but by bending the rules of the universe. What is this? Byakuya grunted, straining against the invisible force. A duel, Naruto said, as he began to walk calmly toward the immobilized captain. And you're losing. He walked until he was standing directly in front of Byakuya. The captain, a noble of the highest order, a master of combat, was helpless, trapped by a power he couldn't even comprehend. Rage and humiliation warred on his face. Naruto didn't gloat. He didn't strike. He simply reached out and created a perfect, unarmed replica of his own body out of the same dark, crystalline stasis material he had used on Sasuke. The ice clone formed between them, its hand resting gently on Byakuya's chest. Then, Naruto released the gravitational field. Freed from the pressure, Byakuya's combat instincts took over. With a furious roar, he thrust his hand forward in a desperate Shakuho-level Kido blast he had been building up, aiming to obliterate Naruto at point-blank range. The blast of pure energy slammed into the chest of the ice clone. There was no explosion. The energy was simply absorbed, swallowed by the absolute zero nature of the clone, which flickered and then dissolved into nothingness. Taking the entirety of Byakuya's attack with it, it had been a checkmate. Naruto had anticipated his final, desperate move and had countered it perfectly, without even trying to harm him. He had won not by overwhelming force, but by outthinking, outmaneuvering, and completely dominating his opponent on every conceivable level. Naruto stood before a shocked, panting, and utterly defeated Rukia Kuchiki. The duel was over. He hadn't thrown a single punch. "I win," Naruto said, his voice quiet, holding no triumph, only a simple statement of fact. Byakuya stared at him, his pride shattered, his understanding of the world broken. He had been defeated, utterly and completely. He looked past Naruto to his sister, who was now on her feet, staring in disbelief, her face streaked with tears of relief. He saw the strength in her eyes, the resolve. He saw the way the Ryoka stood before him, not as a conqueror, but as a guardian who had just proven his worth. With a deep, shuddering breath, the captain of the 6th Division slowly, grudgingly, lowered his head in a slight, almost imperceptible bow. It was an admission of defeat, an act of acknowledgement. The ant-hill had just stopped the storm. Chapter 5 End. Chapter 6. The Purge of the Balance. The dust had settled on the Hokage Plaza, but the shockwaves of Naruto's victory radiated outward, unseen and potent. Rukia Kuchiki, a pillar of the Soul Society's rigid hierarchy, had been humbled. He had honored the terms of the duel with a quiet, stoic grace that was, in its own way, as impressive as his Bankai. He declared that Rukia would remain in Konoha as an official envoy, her mission to monitor the dimensional instability and assist in the eradication of hollows. It was a perfectly crafted political statement. He had preserved his honor while conceding defeat. Before departing through a formal Senkaimon, he had approached Rukia. The stilted, cold distance between them had lessened, replaced by a thin, fragile thread of understanding. "You have chosen your own path, Rukia," he had said, his voice low enough that only she could hear. "See that you walk it with the honor befitting a Kuchiki. Do not disappoint me." It was not an expression of warmth, but it was an acknowledgement. For Byakuya, it was the equivalent of a heartfelt embrace. Renji, on the other hand, had clapped Naruto on the back with a grin. That was equal parts disbelief and newfound respect. "You crazy son of a bitch," he'd said, shaking his head. "You actually did it. You beat the captain. If I hadn't seen it myself, I'd never have believed it." The victory had solidified Naruto's standing in a way no one could have anticipated. He was no longer just a Jinchuriki or a strange anomaly. He was the man who had faced down a Soul Reaper, captain and won through sheer intellect and control. He had become a legitimate political and military power in his own right. Tsunade, ever the pragmatist, immediately began leveraging the new reality, opening formal diplomatic channels with the Soul Society through Rukia. The alliance was fragile, born of necessity and a shared threat, but it was a start. Most importantly, the duel had changed everything between Naruto and Rukia. The unspoken trust had blossomed into an open, powerful bond. In defying her brother and choosing to stand with Naruto, Rukia had severed the final chain of her old life. In fighting a duel for her right to choose, Naruto had shown her the depth of his loyalty. They were no longer just allies. They were partners, bound by a shared destiny they were only just beginning to understand. Their days found a new rhythm, a balance between duty and a burgeoning, quiet affection. They would spend hours in Sasuke's silent room, not in oppressive quiet, but in comfortable companionship. Rukia would sketch in her ever-present sketchbook, crude, rabbit-themed drawings of their friends and teammates, and Naruto would practice his control, learning to subtly manipulate the stasis field around Sasuke, searching for a way to reverse it without shattering it. The threat of the hollows, however, was ever present. Small incursions became more frequent along the Land of Fire's borders, like scavengers testing the fences of a well-stocked pantry. Naruto and Rukia became Konoha's rapid response team, their synergy in combat growing more seamless with every engagement. Rukia, with her Shinigami senses and knowledge, would identify the threats. Naruto, with his absolute power, would end them. He grew more creative, more precise. He wouldn't just erase the hollows, he'd create frictionless patches of ice to make them stumble, freeze the Sero in their mouths, or create localized time-stop fields to hold them for a perfect strike. He was learning to be a scalpel. But peace, like the quiet in Naruto's mind, was a fragile commodity. A new, more insidious storm was gathering, not on the battlefield, but in the corridors of power. It arrived not with a declaration of war, but with a request for a diplomatic summit. A message, delivered via a formal kidogram that shimmered into existence in Tsunade's office, announced the impending arrival of a special envoy from the Soul Society's Central 46 itself. The envoy was described as a specialist in cosmic law and dimensional stability. His name was Koga Kuchiki. Rukia's reaction was immediate and visceral. "Koga," she said, her face paling as Tsunade read the name. "He is, of the main family branch. Far more so than Nisama. He is the head of the Divine Balance Division." Jiraiya, who was present for the briefing, leaned forward. "Divine Balance Division. I've been digging through the intel Byakuya reluctantly provided. That division isn't part of the Gote 13. They're spoken of in whispers. An internal affairs unit, a secret police. Worse," Rukia said, her voice grim. "They are zealots. They believe the Soul King's creation is a perfect, immutable system. Their mandate is to correct any and all imbalances. They don't see shades of gray. There is only balance, and there is chaos. And they purge chaos wherever they find it." A cold feeling settled in Naruto's stomach. "And they think I'm chaos. They think your very existence is a crime against reality," Rukia confirmed. "Byakuya Nisama sees the world in terms of law and honor. Koga sees it in terms of pure, cold logic. He is more dangerous than 1,000 captains." Koga Kuchiki's arrival was the antithesis of Byakuya's. There was no grand display of spiritual pressure. A silent, perfectly formed Senkaimon opened in the center of the village, and Koga, flanked by 2 guards in stark white and silver uniforms that bore the symbol of a balanced scale, stepped through. He was the epitome of noble grace, his features even more refined and severe than Byakuya's. He wore a high-collared captain's haori, but his was a brilliant, sterile white, unadorned by any squad number. His gray eyes were not just cold, they were empty, holding the detached analytical gaze of a surgeon examining a tumor. He was charismatic, his smile disarming, his voice a smooth, reasonable baritone. He was, as Rukia had warned, utterly terrifying. He met with Tsunade, the Fire Daimyo's council, and, via a secure communication jutsu, the other 4 Kage. Naruto was present, at Tsunade's insistence, with Rukia at his side. Koga did not make accusations. He did not issue threats. He presented an argument. "Hokage Dono, honored Kage," he began, his voice calm and persuasive. "I am not here as an adversary. I am here as a partner, a physician who has come to consult on a grave diagnosis." He laid out his case with chilling, impeccable logic. He used advanced Kido to project images into the center of the room, a diagram of the multiverse, showing the world of the living. The Soul Society, and Hueco Mundo as separate but interconnected membranes. "The barrier between our worlds is fragile," Koga explained. "It is maintained by a delicate balance of spiritual and physical laws. The event at your Valley of the End was not a simple explosion. It was a conceptual detonation. Naruto Uzumaki did not merely create a powerful jutsu, he imposed a new absolute law, the law of stillness, onto a reality not designed to withstand it." He gestured to Naruto. His power created a wound, a lesion in the dimensional fabric. "This lesion is what is allowing the hollows to bleed into your world. But that is merely a symptom. The disease is the instability itself." His gaze swept the room, his voice full of grave sincerity. "This instability is growing. The more Naruto-san uses his power, the more he reinforces this new, alien law. The fabric of your reality is beginning to fray. At first, it will be small things. Strange weather, jutsu failing unexpectedly, but it will escalate. Time and space will begin to warp. Eventually, your world's existence will become so paradoxical, so unstable, that it will collapse in on itself, a process we call soul collapse. It will be utterly annihilated. A wave of fear washed through the room. The cage exchanged uneasy glances. Koga's explanation was so logical, so scientific, it was impossible to dismiss. This is a lie, Naruto interjected, his voice tight. My power saved people. It's the only thing that stops the hollows. Koga turned his calm, pitying gaze on him. A fever can kill a virus, Naruto-san. It can also kill the patient. Your power is a fever that will burn your world to ashes. You are not a monster. You are a tragic, walking apocalypse. He then offered his solution. The Divine Balance Division has developed a method. A series of intricate Kido and sealing arts that can repair the dimensional lesion. But to do so, we must first remove the source of the instability. We must seal your power permanently. He presented it as a kindness. A humane, necessary surgery to save the world. Naruto-san would be allowed to live out his life as a normal human, Koga said smoothly. His sacrifice would save everyone. A true hero's choice. The trap was sprung. It was brilliant. Koga wasn't attacking Naruto, he was positioning him as a noble sacrifice. He had turned Naruto's great saint strength, his desire to protect everyone, into a weapon against him. Any refusal would paint Naruto as selfish, willing to risk the world for his own power. The Raikage, slammed his massive fist on the table. A world without jutsu, annihilation. This is unacceptable. If what you say is true, then the boy's power must be sealed. The Tsuchikage, Onoki, floated in his chair, stroking his beard. It is a logical, if harsh, solution. The needs of the many outweigh the needs of the one. Gaara, the Kazekage, was the only one who remained silent, his seafoam green eyes fixed on Naruto, his expression unreadable. Tsunade was cornered. The political pressure was immense. Koga had masterfully framed the debate, turning her allies against her. We will consider your proposal, she said, her voice tight with fury, buying herself time. The summit was a disaster. Koga's logic was a poison, seeping into the minds of Konoha's leadership and its allies. The village elders, led by a quietly opportunistic Danzo, began to pressure Tsunade. They argued that harboring Naruto was a risk the village could no longer afford. Whispers turned into arguments. Factions began to form. Koga hadn't drawn a sword, but he had plunged Konoha into a cold civil war of ideology. That night, Naruto sat on the stone head of the fourth Hokage, looking down at the village that was turning against him. The weight of Koga's words pressed down on him. A walking apocalypse. Was that what he was? Was his every victory just another nail in his world's coffin? Rukia found him there, a silent presence joining him in the darkness. He's a liar, Naruto said, not looking at her. He has to be. He is not a liar, Rukia replied softly, standing beside him. That is what makes him so dangerous. He believes every word he says. He has seen a data point, your power, and has extrapolated the most extreme, logical conclusion. He has no room in his worldview for paradoxes, or for the idea that a power like yours could be a solution instead of a problem. But what if he's right? Naruto whispered, the question a raw wound. What if I'm really going to destroy everything? Then we will find another way, she said with a fierce loyalty that cut through his despair. Koga's logic is flawed because it is absolute. He doesn't account for the human element. For will, for the bonds that hold us together. Your power is not just a law of physics, Naruto. It is an extension of your soul. A soul that wants to protect, not destroy. Her faith in him was a shield, a bulwark against the poison of doubt. He looked at her, at the unwavering strength in her eyes. And felt his own resolve harden. He's playing chess, Naruto said, his mind clearing, the tactical clarity he'd found in his duel with Byakuya returning. He's using politics and fear because he knows he can't beat me in a straight fight. So I can't fight him. I have to outthink him. He needed allies, not just emotional support, but political and military power to counter Koga's influence. His gaze drifted south, toward the land of wind. The next day, Koga made his next move. He didn't wait for Tsunade's decision. His two guards, moving with silent, terrifying efficiency, began to operate within Konoha. They were not spies in the traditional sense. They moved openly, approaching key shinobi, clan heads, and council members. They didn't bribe or threaten. They reasoned. One of them, a woman with silver hair and eyes that seemed to see through you, met with Hiyashi Hyuga. She spoke of the purity of their world's laws and how Naruto's power was contamination that would inevitably corrupt everything, even the sanctity of bloodlines. The other, a stoic man who never spoke, simply demonstrated his power. He approached a training ground where members of the Akamichi, Nara, and Yamanaka clans were practicing. He showed them a Kido technique that could subtly disrupt the flow of chakra, causing Shikamaru's shadow paralysis to flicker and Choji's expansion jutsu to fail. This is the first sign of the fraying, he seemed to imply without a word. It will only get worse. Koga was systematically dismantling Naruto's support structure from the inside out. He was turning his friends and allies into frightened skeptics. But Naruto, guided by Jiraiya's cunning and Rukia's insight, had made his own move. He had sent a personal message, not through official channels, but via a toad summons directly to the Cage's office. It was a simple message, a request for a private meeting. While Koga was busy turning Konoha against him, Naruto, along with Rukia, slipped out of the village under the cover of a genjutsu cast by Jiraiya. They met Gaara at the border, in the windswept expanse of the desert. Gaara stood alone, his arms crossed, the gourd on his back a familiar, comforting sight. His face was as impassive as ever, but his eyes held a deep, questioning intelligence. "The other Cage believe you are a danger," Gaara said, his voice a low rasp, like sand shifting over stone. "And what do you believe, Gaara?" Naruto asked. "I believe what I see," Gaara replied. "I see the boy who taught me that strength is not about power, but about the bonds you fight to protect. The man who is now Cage of my village owes his life and his soul to you." That is a fact that Koga Kuchiki's logic cannot erase. It was the declaration Naruto needed. Gaara did not believe in abstract theories, he believed in the tangible reality of their friendship. "Koga wants to start a war of ideology," Naruto explained, laying out his plan. "He wants world to tear itself apart over what to do with me. We can't let that happen. We have to show them a different path. Not fear and division, but cooperation." He looked from Gaara to Rukia. The Soul Society and the Shinobi nations were facing the same enemy. The Hollows. That herald of chaos. "Koga is so obsessed with me being a problem that he's ignoring the solution right in front of him. A united front." Gaara nodded slowly, understanding dawning in his eyes. "You are not proposing a counter-argument. You are proposing a new paradigm." The plan was simple, bold, and brilliant. Naruto would not fight Koga's political game. He would render it irrelevant by creating a bigger, more important one. He would use his influence with Gaara, his new connection to the Soul Society through Byakuya and Rukia, and his own undeniable power to propose the first-ever joint Shinobi-Shinigami military alliance. They returned to Konoha just as the tension was reaching its breaking point. Danzo had Mali petitioned the council for Tsunade to be stripped of her authority to handle the crisis, arguing she was too emotionally compromised. Koga watched from the sidelines, his expression serene, his victory seemingly at hand. Tsunade called an emergency summit in the main council chamber. The room was thick with hostility. The elders, clan heads, and Jonin commanders were divided. Koga was invited to speak, and he delivered his final, closing argument. "The choice is simple," he said, his voice resonating with calm, irrefutable reason. "A single, noble sacrifice to preserve your entire reality, or sentimental attachment that will lead to universal annihilation. The path of logic is clear." Before the council could vote, the doors to the chamber swung open. Naruto entered, flanked by Rukia. But they were not alone. Behind them stood Gaara of the Sand, the Cage, his presence an immediate and shocking statement of support. "There is a third option," Naruto announced, his voice ringy, with a confidence that silenced the room. He didn't argue against Koga's logic. He didn't defend his own power. He laid out a new vision. "Koga-san is right about one thing," Naruto began, shocking everyone. "Our world is in danger. We are facing threats we have never encountered before. Hollows, primordial beings of chaos. Our old ways of thinking are not enough." He looked around the room, the eyes of the shinobi he had grown up with. Koga offers you a solution born of fear. He wants you to cut out a part of yourself because you are afraid of it. I offer you a solution born of strength. Instead of turning inward and dividing ourselves, we must look outward and unite. Gaara stepped forward. The village hidden in the sand officially recognizes the threat of the Hollows and this, Amatsu Mikabashi. We also recognize Naruto Uzumaki and Rukia Kuchiki as the world's foremost experts on this threat. Suna pledges its full support to a joint task force, led by Konoha and Suna, to combat this enemy. Rukia then stepped forward. I have been in communication with my brother, Captain Rukia Kuchiki. He has agreed that a cooperative approach may be more effective than an isolationist one. He has authorized me to act as a bridge, to share Soul Society tactics and intelligence with our new allies. Naruto had completely reframed the debate. It was no longer about, what do we do about Naruto? It was now about, how do we fight this new war? He had created a coalition, presented a proactive plan, and offered a future based on strength and unity, not fear and amputation. Koga Kuchiki stood in stunned silence. His perfectly logical argument, his entire strategy, had been rendered obsolete. He had been playing chess, meticulously moving his pieces to trap the king, only for the king to flip the board over and declare they were playing a different game entirely. Naruto had not won by force. He hadn't even won with a better argument. He had won with a better idea. The mood in the room shifted. Hope, a far more potent force than fear, began to spread. The shinobi, warriors by nature, were far more receptive to a plan that involved fighting an enemy than one that involved sacrificing one of their own. Koga looked at Naruto, and for the first time, the calm, serene mask cracked. A flash of pure, cold fury burned in his eyes. He had been outmaneuvered, his logic defeated by something he could not quantify: charisma, loyalty, and the unshakable bond between friends. He gave a slight, stiff bow, his face an unreadable mask once more. The council's wisdom is its own, he said, the words tight. I will convey this development to my superiors. He turned and strode from the room, his two guards falling into step behind him. But as he passed Naruto, his voice was a venomous whisper. Meant only for him. You have chosen the path of chaos, boy. You have rallied the flawed and the sentimental to your cause. You think you have won, but you have only delayed the inevitable. The balance will be restored. The next time we meet, diplomacy will not be an option. I will purge you myself. The threat was a promise. Naruto had won the political battle, but he had made a powerful, implacable enemy. The game of chess was over. The real war was about to begin. Chapter 6 End. Chapter 7. The still point of the turning world. Koga Kuchiki's departure left a vacuum in its wake. The oppressive, analytical tension that had gripped Konoha dissipated, replaced by a frenetic, uncertain energy. Naruto had won the political battle, but his victory had thrown the world into uncharted territory. The newly proposed alliance between the shinobi nations and the Soul Society was a concept so radical it was almost unthinkable. Councils were convened, messengers were dispatched, and the entire political landscape of the elemental nations began to shift around the new reality Naruto had forged. He, however, felt none of the triumph. Koga's parting words had been a poisoned dart, finding a home in the deepest part of his uncertainty. The path of chaos, you have only delayed the inevitable. Was he a leader, or a fool leading his friends into a disaster of his own making? The whispers of the Herald of Mikabashi echoed Koga's sentiment. You are an anchor holding this flawed creation together. But what if the anchor was dragging the whole ship down? His power was a black box. He knew what it could do, but he didn't understand why. Where did it come from? What were its limits? He had frozen time, warped gravity, and erased beings from existence, all on instinct. It was like being given the keys to the universe without a manual. You're thinking too loud again, Rukia said, her voice cutting through his brooding. They were in their usual spot, the quiet clearing in the forest of death. The aftermath of the political storm had left them little time for training, and the respite was welcome. Naruto was sitting on a large tree root, staring at his own hands as if they belonged to someone else. Rukia was leaning against a tree, sketching idly in her ever-present notepad. He got in my head, Naruto admitted, the words tasting like ash. What if my power really is breaking the world? Every time I use it, am I just making things worse? Rukia stopped sketching. She looked at him, her violet eyes serious. Doubt is a luxury a leader cannot afford, Naruto. Your people, Gaara, even my brother. In his own infuriating way, they are following your lead. If you falter, the entire alliance falls apart. It's easy for you to say, he retorted, a flash of his old frustration breaking through. Your power has rules. A Shikai, a Bankai, Kido, it's all part of a system. Mine came from nowhere. It feels alien, wrong. Then we find out where it came from, she said simply. As if the solution were obvious. We find its rules. The answer, as it often did in Naruto's life, came from Jiraiya. The Toad Sage, having exhausted every scroll in Konoha's library, had come to a single frustrating conclusion. There's nothing, he'd told them, surrounded by a mountain of ancient texts in the Hokage's archives. Not a single mention of a power like this in the entire recorded history of chakra. It's not a bloodline. It's not a sage art. It's something older, more fundamental. He had stroked his chin, a thoughtful gleam in his eye. When you find a question that isn't in any book, there's only one place left to look for an answer. And so, they found themselves on a journey. Jiraiya, having created a complex, multi-layered stasis seal to maintain Yuke's prison for a few weeks, a seal that required 3 elite medical nin to constantly monitor, had initiated the reverse summoning technique. Naruto and Rukia stood beside him, and with a puff of smoke and a lurching sense of dislocation, Konoha vanished. They reappeared in a world of vibrant, impossible greens and blues. Giant, moss-covered toad statues loomed like mountains. The air was thick with a strange, oily humidity and the palpable thrum of nature chakra so potent it made the air buzz. They had arrived at Mount Myoboku, the home of the toads. Rukia stared, her artist's eye wide with wonder. The reishi, the spiritual energy here, it's incredible. It's purer, more ancient than anything in the Soul Society. Their arrival did not go unnoticed. 2 towering, sword-wielding toad guardians, Fukasaku and Shima, appeared before them. Jiraiya boy, you bring guests, Fukasaku croaked, his voice old and raspy. Naruto-chan, you've gotten taller, Shima chirped, before her eyes landed on Rukia. And who is this lovely little morsel? She smells of moonlight and cold steel. After hurried introductions and Jiraiya's explanation of their purpose, they were led to the most sacred place on the mountain, a deep, mist-filled cavern where Gamamaru, the great toad sage, sat on a colossal throne. He was ancient, his skin wrinkled and covered in growths, his eyes half closed as if in a perpetual dream. A strange, horned crown sat upon his head. The blonde child returns. Gamamaru's voice was a deep, slow rumble that seemed to emanate from the stone of the cavern itself. And he does not come alone. The child of the balancers, she is far from home. He opened his eyes, and their gaze was not that of a simple animal. They were deep, swirling pools of wisdom that seemed to see not just Naruto and Rukia, but their pasts. Their futures, the very nature of their souls. You seek answers about the stillness, the great toad sage rumbled. It wasn't a question. You wield a power that predates the very concept of chakra. A power that the sage of 6 paths himself encountered and chose to leave dormant. Jiraiya gasped. You mean, this power has existed before? Before all things, there were 2, Gamamaru explained. His voice like a slow-moving glacier. The chaos and the stillness. The endless, shrieking potential of what could be, and the silent, absolute finality of what is. They are not good or evil. They are the fundamental principles of existence. One is an engine of endless change, the other is the anchor that gives that change meaning. For eons, they existed in a perfect, violent balance. His ancient eyes focused on Naruto. The sage of 6 paths, my old friend Hagoromo, was born of a world teeming with the lingering energies of that conflict. He chose to build his system, the system of chakra, from the energies of life and will, avoiding the 2 primordial poles. But the potential for them remained, buried deep within the bloodlines of his children, Indra and Asura. The potential for absolute chaos, and the potential for absolute stillness. Asura, Naruto whispered. He was Asura's reincarnate. The clash at the valley, Gamamaru continued. The union of your chakra. The power of the 9 tails, the curse mark of Orochimaru, the Sharingan of an Uchiha, it was a perfect storm of energies. But it was your will, boy, at the center of it all. Your desperate, absolute desire for the conflict to stop. That desire was the key that unlocked the cage. You did not create the power of absolute zero. You awakened it. It is your inheritance. The revelation was staggering. His power wasn't a freak accident. It was a birthright, a fundamental force of the universe that had been lying dormant within his soul. The sage's gaze then shifted to Rukia. And your arrival was no accident. The raw, conceptual power of the stillness tore a hole in the veil, and the universe, in its own way, sought to balance the equation. It pulled you, a wielder of a lesser, more mundane stillness, your blade of ice, to the epicenter. Your soul resonates with his, a harmonic echo that stabilizes the rift he created. He then delivered his prophecy, his voice filling the cavern with its weight. The star of chaos that fears stillness has awoken. It sees the lock on its cage and will seek to shatter it. It will send its heralds. It will corrupt the ambitious and the broken. It will offer the power of endless change to those who feel trapped by fate. The image of Sasuke's furious, desperate face flashed in Naruto's mind. Only the union of two worlds, through two souls bound as one, can hope to quiet the coming storm. The stillness must learn to move, and the blade must learn to be an anchor. Together, you are the eye of the hurricane. Apart, you are just the storm. The prophecy hung in the air, its meaning both clear and terrifyingly vague. Naruto and Rukia looked at each other, the weight of their shared destiny settling upon them. They were not just allies anymore. They were two sides of a cosmic coin, their fates, and the fates of their worlds, inextricably linked. The days that followed on Mount Myoboku were a revelation. Away from the pressures of Konoha, the constant threat of hollows, and the political maneuvering, there was only the vibrant, living energy of the mountain and the words of the great Toad Sage. Naruto, armed with this new understanding, began to train with a purpose he'd never had before. He wasn't just trying to control his power, he was trying to commune with it. Fukasaku and Shima taught him a new form of sage mode, one that didn't just gather nature energy, but sought to find the balance between the world's motion and his own inner stillness. He learned to feel the flow of time like a river, and his power was the ability to build a dam, divert its course, or create a quiet eddy. The applications were mind-boggling. He learned to create a stasis field around his own body, allowing him to move at incredible speeds by stopping the air resistance in front of him. He learned to freeze the moisture in a cloud to create a solid platform to stand on in midair. Rukia, meanwhile, found her own training. The pure, ancient reishi of the mountain was like a feast for her soul. Her own abilities grew stronger, sharper. She sparred with the great toad warriors, her zanjutsu reaching a level of speed and precision she had only dreamed of. She learned to infuse her Kido with the nature energy of the mountain, giving her spells a wild, untamed power they had never possessed before. A simple shakuho, infused with sage energy, could now blast a hole through a small mountain. But their most important training was done together. They were the stillness and the blade. Naruto would create complex, shifting elds of localized time stops and gravitational warps, and Rukia would have to navigate them, her senses honed to a razor's edge, her movements fluid and precise. It was a deadly, beautiful dance. She would attack, and he would have to counter not by stopping her, but by subtly altering the world around her, redirecting her momentum, turning her own strength against her. In this shared crucible, our bond deepened into something more profound than partnership. The long afternoons, after a day of exhausting training, were filled with quiet conversation. They sat by a serene, bubbling toad oil pond, sharing stories of their childhoods, their dreams, their fears. I always wanted to be acknowledged, Naruto confessed one evening, watching the reflection of the giant toad moons on the water. That's why I was so loud. I thought if I made enough noise, someone would have to see me. But now, this power, this quiet, they see it, but they're afraid of it. I'm more alone than ever. You are not alone, Rukia said softly, her shoulder brushing against his. I see it, and I am not afraid. She looked down at her sketchbook, where she had drawn a crude but affectionate picture of Naruto, with exaggerated whiskers and a determined glint in his eye. In the Seraite, everything is about your family, your rank, your duty. For the longest time, I thought that was all I was, Rukia Kuchiki's little sister. A tool for the honor of the clan. But here, with you, I feel like I am just, Rukia. He looked at her, at the way the strange moonlight of Myoboku caught the purple of her eyes. He saw not a noble, not a soul reaper, but the woman who had stood by him, challenged him, and believed in him when no one else did. The quiet between them was no longer empty. It was filled with a deep, unspoken affection. He reached out, his fingers gently touching her cheek. The gesture was tentative, uncertain. She didn't pull away. She leaned into his touch, her eyes fluttering closed for a second. In that moment, the noise of the world, the prophecies, the coming war, it all faded away. There was only the stillness between them, a stillness that was not empty, but full of a powerful, blossoming warmth. He leaned in, and she met him halfway. Their first kiss was not a fiery, passionate explosion. It was quiet, gentle, and as profound as the silence he now commanded. It was an acknowledgement, a promise, the union of two souls, finding a home in each other. The tender moment was shattered by a piercing, psychic shriek that echoed not in their ears, but in their minds. A wave of pure, malevolent chaos washed over the mountain, so potent that the very air seemed to curdles. Naruto and Rukia sprang to their feet, their hands instinctively reaching for weapons that weren't there. On the peak of the highest toad statue, a figure shimmered into existence. It was the herald of Mikabashi, the same shadowy entity Naruto had erased in Konoha. But it was different now. It was more solid, its form coalescing into a nightmarish parody of a suit of samurai armor made of solidified shadow, its crimson eyes burning with a hateful, focused intelligence. The lock has found its key, it hissed, its voice slithering through their minds. A touching, futile gesture. My master is patient, but its patience has its limits. The game is over. It is time to remove you from the board. The herald was stronger, its presence a direct assault on reality itself. The vibrant green moss on the stones around it withered and died, turning to black dust. The very air around it warped and twisted. It tracked us, Jiraiya yelled, appearing beside them, his face grim. It followed the resonance of your power. It doesn't matter, Naruto said, his voice calm, but this time it was a calm filled with a cold, protective fury. He stepped in front of Rukia, his body radiating a palpable aura of stillness. It made a mistake coming here. A mistake, the herald mocked. I have come bearing a gift. A demonstration of my master's power. It raised a hand, and the world screamed. Naruto felt a sensation he had only felt once before, the moment he had first awakened his power. The herald wasn't attacking them. It was attacking the very laws of the mountain. It was targeting the flow of time itself. The buzzing of the nature chakra ceased. The chirping of the strange insects fell silent. The bubbling of the pond stopped. The herald was not freezing time in a localized field. It was attempting to accelerate it to an infinite degree, to rot the entire mountain to dust in a single second. Naruto's eyes widened. He had to counter it. Not by stopping it, but by anchoring it. He roared, and it was not a sound of rage, but a sound of pure will. He slammed his hands onto the ground, and a wave of absolute stillness erupted from him. A dome of pure, conceptual power that expanded to cover the entire mountain. It was a battle of concepts. The herald's power of chaotic, endless change versus Naruto's power of absolute, immovable stasis. The world under the dome became a nauseating battleground of paradoxes. A tree would age 1,000 years into dust, only to be snapped back into its prime. The tear in the pond would flash into steam and then instantly freeze into a solid block. The strain on Naruto was immense. He was fighting a primordial force, his will against an engine of entropy. Veins stood out on his forehead, and a trickle of blood ran from his nose. Rukia saw him struggling. The prophecy echoed in her mind. The stillness must learn to move, and the blade must learn to be an anchor. She knew what she had to do. She couldn't fight the herald's power directly, but she could help Naruto. She ran to him, placing her hands on his back, and poured all of her own energy, her Raryoku, her very soul, into him. Her power, the lesser cold, the mundane stillness, acted as a stabilizing agent, a focusing lens for his own. With her support, Naruto's control solidified. The chaotic fluctuations ceased. He wasn't just fighting the herald to a stalemate anymore. He was winning. He was pushing the chaos back, reinforcing the reality of the mountain. The herald let out a screech of fury and frustration. It could not win a direct battle of wills against the fully awakened stillness, especially one anchored by its harmonic counterpart. With a final, desperate burst of power, the herald broke off its attack and vanished. Its mocking laughter echoing in their minds. This is not the end, little Godling. It is merely the end of the beginning. The dome of stasis collapsed. The world snapped back to normal. The mountain was scarred, patches of aged and warped reality dotting the landscape, but it was saved. Naruto collapsed to his knees, panting, the immense strain finally hitting him. Rukia knelt beside him, her own energy reserves dangerously low, but her eyes were shining with pride. They had faced a direct assault from a cosmic entity and they had won. Together, Jiraiya looked at them, at the two exhausted but resolute figures, and then at the scarred but standing mountain. The great Toad Sage's prophecy had been fulfilled. The stillness had moved, and the blade had been its anchor. They were no longer just a boy and a girl. They were a force of nature, a single, unified power against the coming darkness. And in the quiet aftermath of the battle, their hands found each other, their fingers lacing together, a silent promise that whatever came next, they would face it as one. Chapter 7 End.